Holy War, Bloodbound, an action fantasy. Holy War Series Book 1, written by Chris Lowry, narrated by Andrew McDermott. The Holy War, Chapter 1. A knight is virtuous. He never denies battle, even when he is outnumbered. A knight is poor, chaste, kind to women. The Templar Creed. Rows of dark tents sat in blotches of darkness in the murky night. Shadows moved among the tents, clanking in mismatched armour that reflected the small flames of crackling fires in front of some tents. They spread out like spokes on a wheel from a larger tent set in the centre. The entrance was flanked by 2 guards who stared at the men shuffling in the darkness. Each guard held one hand on a long, narrow triangular shield set point down in the trampled earth, the other hand on the pommel of swords at their waist. The shields were scarred and beaten, the red Templar cross standing out on the white nicked background. A man marched through the tents, intent on his destination. His brow was furrowed in concentration, but he greeted the men as he passed, a slight relaxation of the glare he wore permanently. The tent flaps were flung open, and a Saracen rushed out. Richard dropped a hand to his sword. The Arab was followed by 4 bodyguards swathed in robes. It was Saeed, the diplomat, and his entourage. By the look on his face, Richard could see that the peace talks were not exactly as he expected. Richard watched as Saeed climbed on his magnificent stallion and guided it out of the camp, toward a small rising canyon in the distance. After he could no longer make out the clopping of the horse, nor see the dim shadows moving backlit by the starry sky, he moved past the guards and into the tent. Chapter 2. The general was packing. The tent was crowded with 2 giant plank tables, one with a small selection of camp food scattered across the top, the second a neat and meticulous map of the surrounding area, weighed down with heavy candlesticks. The general, Louis, stood at the war table and shut a small wooden chest. He reached for one of the candlesticks and set it in another chest. A page scurried behind him, wrapping up blankets with cord. "It went well," Richard jested. "You could tell," answered the general. "The army is on the move tonight. We can't wait until dawn." "There were no terms?" "Saeed is a stubborn fool, and he represents an even greater fool. Of course we agreed to disagree, and promised to meet again soon. In the interim, they still advance." "And we fall back before them." The general glanced over his shoulder. He was not as tall as Richard, but broader in the chest and shoulder. His grizzled visage was scarred from many battles, and his eyes held the wisdom gained from years of experience. He smiled, and one side of his face didn't lift as high as the other, giving him the appearance of a snarl. "I have to protect my treasure." "Jerusalem's treasure." Louis glanced at him sharply. "Of course, Jerusalem's treasure. You must remain behind, to guard our retreat." Richard stared at the general for several seconds as he considered the consequences of refusal. He wouldn't refuse, and the general knew it, because in the order of the poor knights of the Temple of Solomon there was a strict chain of command, and swift repercussions for failure to follow command. He voiced his concern to the general. "To stay is suicide." "Ah," Louis agreed, "but imagine the glory." "The glory won't matter to me. I'll be dead." Louis finished packing the second chest and motioned his page to remove both from the tent. "Call in the captains," he instructed. "Yes, my lord," said the young boy as he hastened out. The general moved in closer to Richard and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's been decided. You and 6 others will hold the pass, while we fall back to a more defensible position." Richard glanced at the hand. It was the first time the man had touched him in all the years they had campaigned together. He scowled at his commander. "What could be more defensible than this pass?" he asked. "They can only approach uphill, no more than 10 abreast. We have held it thus far with no losses." "The Sultan approaches, and with him the horde," said the general. He rolled up the map and packed it away in a leather cylinder. "There are 10,000 in the horde, perhaps more. We would all be slaughtered if we stay." "They can't bring the full force to bear in the pass," Richard explained again. He almost said it slowly, as if speaking to a child, but he knew the general was aware of the tactical advantage they had with the current location. There was something else, another reason he was moving the main army. "We will not lose all we have gained," said Louis. The general moved away from the table and sat in a camp chair. It was placed upon a small dais, and though it was a simple wooden chair, the general had it draped in velvet and shrouds. Richard couldn't help but note it purposely looked like a small throne. "This is about the treasure." "If we cannot save the treasure," argued the general, "everything we have done here is for naught. Yours is an impossible task, to keep the remainder of your brothers safe to fight another day, while you give the greatest sacrifice. I do not ask this lightly." "You do not ask at all," answered Richard. The two men stared at each other in the flickering light from a small fire in a brazier. The general's face was impassive, the decision made. Richard knew arguing was pointless, and a diversion of energy. He bowed his head slightly. "Who will remain with me?" he asked. The general nodded and snarled the half-smile again. "You will tell them. I have preparations to attend." "More gold to pack," said Richard. "Chaucer, William, Kenalt, Ralph, Geoffrey, and the Troyes." The general ignored his comment. Richard sighed. "You do not make it easy." The general spun around to give rebuke, but the tent flaps fell back in place and he was alone in his tent. He snorted, and the snarl turned into a full-blown, scarred smile. Chapter 3. Richard marched through the dark camp, his eyes carefully scanning the ground for any sleeping form between the tents. Not every soldier had a tent, so they often curled up in a threadbare blanket back to back, with a comrade to share warmth under the chill desert night. He zeroed in on a small tent with a tiny fire glowing in front, and stepped his way closer. 3 men hunched around the fire, hands and feet extended to the heat. They glanced up as Richard approached. "We are to stay?" asked Geoffrey. Richard nodded as he squatted next to the fire and rubbed his hands together. "They leave before dawn." William was next to Geoffrey, but the 2 men could have been brothers. They were of equal height, both with the same hair, the same sharp nose and piercing eyes, despite being from different continents. "Who is with us?" he asked. "Chaucer, Ralph, de Troyes." "That's all? It's suicide." "At least Ralph will be happy," said Kenalt. "He can die killing as many of the heathens as he wants." "I will not be happy to die," said Geoffrey, as he stared sullenly into the fire. "None of us are," added Richard, "but it is our duty." "Duty by hell," William cursed. "This is Louis's revenge. Every sycophant with their lips on his arse is not staying behind." Kenalt stood and stretched. "Have you seen the Troyes?" "I came straight here." Richard rose beside him. "Should we go with you?" asked William. His fingers danced along the pommel of his sword. Richard stretched and loosened the tightened muscles in his back. He shook his head. "No," he said. "Prepare your kits." Geoffrey stood and put an arm on Richard to hold him. He lowered his voice and leaned in. "Should we release our men?" Richard glanced around at the 3 men in front of the fire. He knew little about them, little more than name and the fact they were seasoned knights, warriors with training and, after this campaign, experience that made them formidable. He felt shame in his heart, shame that he was going to lead these men to their death, while men like the general would live. But he had an oath, blood-bound to the order, and he knew that with their sacrifice, many more of his brothers could live. He was not sure if any could live with a mutiny in the ranks, and he would only be party to the sacrifice of these 7, no more. "We don't keep our mounts," he said. Each of the men had a horse and retinue. carryovers from their life before joining the order. Despite a vow of poverty and turning their lands and possessions over, each knight was allowed to retain the trappings of war to carry to the Holy Land and fight. The oath wasn't always practical, and it gave Richard a little pause. If it allowed for wiggle room in preparing for battle, perhaps it would allow a little for the survival of these men who were as valuable as the treasure they sought to protect. "It is your choice to send your men," he said. "I'm sending mine." "Do not send the boy with Louis," cautioned Connaught. "He watches him too closely." Richard smiled. "Have you seen the boy at his knives? I would like him alone with Louis for 5 minutes. The Sultan would have another eunuch for his guard." The men laughed with him quietly. Richard left them to their preparations. Chapter 4. Richard picked his way across the sleeping bodies again to a tent on the edge of the camp. It was another large one, though not quite as big as the general's, and in contrast to the rest of the camp. A large fire cast a huge circle of light around the front. It was a beacon to navigate toward in the dark, but a waste, thought Richard. A handsome, muscled young man stood in the circle and practiced his sword work. He was stripped to the waist, and despite the night chill, sweat glistened on his muscled torso. He danced around with the sword, doing battle with imaginary foes, and despite the shadow boxing, his skill was evident. He was fast and lithe, and carried an air of danger. Richard stopped at the edge of the imagined battlefield and watched for a moment. "A word," he said finally. De Troyes paused in mid-strike. His young page, Leon, ran from a spot beside the tent flap and quickly began wiping down his back and arms, patting them dry before chill set in. "Only one," said de Troyes. "That's very out of character for you." He turned towards Richard and cocked his head back confidently. Unsure as he was of the background of this man, Richard knew he had been a noble. He still carried himself as such, and a French noble was sometimes very hard to deal with. He hoped he was ready for this conversation. "The army moves out in the morning," he started. "Finally," said de Troyes, "this place stinks of... We do not go with them." "Who does not?" De Troyes waved Leon off and stalked towards Richard. "You, me, 5 others." De Troyes stopped just short of sword reach. "Against 1,000?" he snarled. "You need to work on your numbers," said Richard. "There are only 100 in the Sultan's advance guard. We buy time for the others to escape." "With the gold, of course." "It's an expensive war." A voice carried between them. "It's not a war. It's a holy mission." De Troyes jumped, held his sword ready. Richard shifted slightly toward the darkness as Ralph stepped into the firelight. The flames flickered off his shaved head and cast shadows on his narrow face. A scar ran from his hairline down to his chin. It was the face of a haunted man. "I was coming to find you next," said Richard. "I was at prayer. God commanded me to stay behind." "Louis must have overheard him," said de Troyes. Ralph placed a hand on the sword at his waist. "Do not make light of the Lord's commands." Richard stepped deftly between the two men, blocking Ralph's view of the giant. "We are ordered to hold the pass while the army retreats." Ralph genuflected and glanced at the sky. "Then I will not fight alone." De Troyes stepped to one side of Richard and glared at the pious warrior. "Go pray for God to keep us alive and get us out of this." "I'll pray hardest for you," growled Ralph. His hard eyes moved from de Troyes to Richard and back again before he stepped back into the darkness. "Do not torment him," advised Richard. "Me? I am nothing to the madness he carries inside." Richard nodded. Of all the men he knew in the order, Ralph was the most tormented. Perhaps it accounted for his piety, his devotion, and even, like de Troyes hinted, his madness. "The others are releasing their men," he told the Frenchman. "Part with my boys? Never." "It's your choice," said Richard, "but you are consigning them to our fate." De Troyes opened his mouth to say something, but could think of nothing. He glared at Richard instead. "I go to Chaucer," said Richard. "The scholar? Have you tried the horse tent, or better yet, visited yourself?" Richard ignored the jibe and went to find the man they called the scholar. Chapter 5. Ralph slowly walked away from the firelight. He made his way further out into the desert until the solace satisfied him. He pulled his sword and set it point first on the ground, so that it stood like a cross in front of him, and he kneeled. The stars glittered and sparkled in the sky, and he marvelled at the majesty of creation. The desert sounds surrounded him. He bowed his head and began to pray. Behind him, a woman's shrill laughter cut through the night air. He cringed and bowed his head further. His lips moved faster as the litany spilled from them. His knuckles gripped the pommel until they cracked, and still he didn't stop. "O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer." Chapter 6. On the edge of camp, a small, garish purple tent nestled between two small fires. A small line of men crouched or kneeled to one side. They looked bored and listless and impatient. Richard hid a smile as he approached. "Who is in there?" he asked. "The damn scholar's been in there for an hour," groused one grizzled veteran. He glared up at Richard, and as he noted who it was, popped to attention. "None of us will get a ride," said a second man, before he too noticed Richard and jumped to attention. Richard marched to the tent and pushed aside the flap to enter. The interior was filled with the smoke from incense that smelled of spice, and a small wood fire that did little to dispel the darkness of the interior. It cast a small orange glow that failed to penetrate past the sheer curtains that turned the cramped space into a small maze of pillows, rugs, and blankets. "Chaucer!" called Richard. A giggle escaped from behind a veil. Richard pushed it aside, and then another, and gazed at a soft-looking naked man with long hair and glittering eyes. Chaucer leaned against an equally naked, smoky-eyed woman. Rachel was pretty in an exotic fashion. They languished together, intertwined on a bed of pillows. "Richard!" Chaucer drew out his name. "Come to watch me woo the fair maiden?" "I do not charge as much just to watch." She smiled at the night. "Should I pay to listen to you read?" Richard asked. "My poetry warms her heart," said Chaucer. "It fires her passion, not like those cretins whose coin only buys a few thrusts. Cretins who in volume can make her a rich woman. Does she listen to you for free?" "What else would I do with the heathen's gold?" the young man laughed. Richard grabbed a pillow and sat on it in front of the couple. "Watch it ride away with the army," he said. Chaucer traced a finger down her face. "Better with you, I think." She nibbled his ear and caressed his skinny chest. "We are chosen to hold the pass," Richard informed him. "And the cowards depart with their tails between their legs. We meet at dawn to develop a strategy. Finish your business here." "Send the cretins packing," Chaucer said, and pulled Rachel close. "I've many poems to read, and much gold to spend." Rachel rolled on top of him as Richard left. "I will not cost you anything tonight, my love," she whispered. "My gratitude is boundless, my sweet." He twirled her ebon hair in his fingers. "But after tonight, where will I spend it? All I have to give is yours." She buried her face in his neck and sobbed. Chaucer wrapped his arms tight and held her as if there were no tomorrow. Chapter 7. Richard marched through the almost silent camp. The fires that had flickered earlier were burned low to embers now. The men still slept in fitful starts. The average soldier in camp could be up and ready to move in less than 30 minutes. Their commanders wisely decided to let them rest, while sparse command tents were broken down and packed away. He reached his own dwelling and knelt in front of a small fire. There was a pot on the edge of a rack next to a cup, and he poured himself a glass of tea. It was a luxury he allowed himself, a carry-over from life before the order. The tent flap folded open, and a young teenage boy stared out. "Do you need anything, sire?" asked James. He was 14, eyes wide, and already starting to grow tall. As a squire, his training was just beginning. He would enjoy a 4-year tutelage under Richard before turning 18, when he could decide to go out into the world or dedicate himself to the Knights of the Temple. Or under normal circumstances, those would be his choices. Now, Richard would no longer teach him, though the boy had been under his care since coming in as a page 4 years ago. As if summoned, Paul, his page, stepped out with James. The 10-year-old wiped his sleepy eyes. "Come with me," Richard commanded softly. The two boys glanced at each other and moved to sit across from Richard. The knight lifted the pot and began to pour a small cup of tea for each of the boys. Paul hurried to take over, but Richard stopped him. "Allow me." He passed a cup to each of the boys. "Thank you, sir," said James. "Thank you," parroted Paul. Richard looked them over. They were slight boys, though James was starting to fill out. His shoulders were rounded and well developed from the several hours each day Richard had him practice at sword and shield. They cupped their hands around the tea to warm them and shivered closer to the fire. "In the morning," Richard said, "your service to me is ended." James glanced at him in alarm. "Sire, I apologize for any offence I may have done. I was not aware I was in error." "Me too, sir," piped in Paul. Richard smiled at them kindly. "It is nothing you did, either of you. You have both performed better than I could have ever hoped. You will make great knights some day. James, sooner than you think." James wiped at one eye. "Then why are you releasing us?" he asked. "The rumours haven't started yet. You boys have your heads too deep in your studies. Perhaps I asked too much of you. When I was a squire, we gossiped like young girls. There was no secret on any campaign we could not ferret out." "The army marches in the morning," said Paul. "So one does not study as hard as one pretends," smiled Richard. "I am sorry, sire." "There is no need," said Richard. "A soldier gathers knowledge in many ways. Yes, the army leaves in the morning, but I am ordered to remain behind. I want you to go with the army." "No," said James. "We will stay with you," added Paul. "Thank you, it is a kind offer. But no, I release you from my service." James glanced at Paul, who looked up at him with scared, pleading eyes. "Then I am free." Richard sipped his tea. "To find another master, to finish your training." "Then I will stay." "And I will stay too," said Paul. Richard shook his head. "This is not your battle," he said. "You will go and grow and fight some other day." "But sire," said James, "I have not released you yet. I will need my sword and lance prepared for battle. Go, finish before you sleep." "Sire." "Now," Richard commanded. The tone of his voice brooked no dissent. Chapter 8. By the time the sun crested the horizon, porters had struck the tents, and squires hurried to assist knights under their horses. A column snaked down the back end of the pass. Richard stood with 5 others in front of Rachel's tent at the edge of camp, and watched their brothers ride away with small waves or nods. "As Ralph slunk away at the head of the column?" groused Troyes. Ralph marched up behind them to stand with Richard. "If only to search for you," he said. The general wheeled his mount away from the column and pointed over to them. "It's a hard choice I've had to make," he said to them. "But did you get your gold safely out?" asked Troyes. Louis ignored him. "I will send a proxy to parley again. Drag it out to buy more time," he instructed. Richard nodded his head and bowed. Geoffrey scoffed. "Do not pretend to tell Richard his business. He knows better than you the art of war." "I am still commander of this army," Louis sputtered. "You do not command here," said Connaught. "We are dead men, and dead men do not suffer fools. The 7 knights were lined up, shoulder to shoulder, a broad wall of sword and shield. Louis spun his horse around as it skittered under his nervous attention. "I choose wisely," he said. "I will see to your horse, your estates, and your boys." De Troyes stepped out of the line and pulled his sword. "Go, but protect your gold. We will protect your ass." He swatted the general's horse with the flat of his blade. The stallion reared and almost unseated Louis, then bolted down the pass toward the head of the column. "It is ill will to not respect the position, even if you do not respect the man," advised Richard. "A commander leads by example, Richard," said Geoffrey. "And we do not see your backside bouncing away," added Kenalt. "At least we can make a good account of ourselves," said William. "I have prayed as much," Ralph said. The men grew quiet as Rachel stepped out of her tent and moved into the back of a simple wooden cart. She spied Chaucer in line and blew him a sad kiss. He smiled back and pretended to catch it and rub it against his cheek. "Now," she instructed her servant, a withered old hag in a black wrap. The old woman chucked the reins on the horse, and the cart rolled past him to join the column. 2 soldiers in the column noted the cart and hurried to catch up to it. They were the 2 men from outside of her tent the previous night. "We missed you last night," said Philip, the taller of the 2. "You could have made a handsome profit of us," added his companion John. "You need not worry over me," said Rachel. "I have all I need." Philip and John paced the back of the cart and moved closer. "You got all you wanted, and we got nothing," Philip pouted. "I have nothing you need," said Rachel. Philip jumped into the back of the cart. He used his superior size to push her down on the floor. "But you have 2 things I want." He twisted her arm and shoved her face into the wooden plank. Rachel screamed, and he shoved harder. He struggled to pull her billowing dress up. "Get the gold," he grunted to John. The other man jumped into the cart. The servant lashed out with a riding crop, but John grabbed it and jerked it from her withered grasp. He whipped the servant across the face. Rachel screamed again as Philip held her with one hand and tugged at his leggings with the other. "Save a little for me," John guffawed. Chaucer heard Rachel scream and turned. He drew his sword and ran toward the cart. Ralph charged past him, his sword held high. He leapt into the back of the cart and smashed Philip across the head with the flat of his sword. Ralph ducked under John's blade and shoulder-checked him. The soldier flipped backwards out of the cart. Philip hobbled up. Ralph grabbed him by his lowered pants and tossed him out of the cart. Chaucer arrived and pressed the tip of his sword against John's neck. The razor-sharp blade drew a thin line of blood. "I should lop off your head as a trophy for the Saracens." "Please, sir," John mewed as he cowered. Rachel adjusted her dress and climbed up. "Thank you, good night," she cried and threw her arms around Ralph. "Do not touch me," he said roughly, and backed away. His calves hit the edge of the cart, and he tumbled out to land next to Philip. Rachel stared at him in confusion. "She was only showing her gratitude," said Chaucer. Ralph shoved himself off the ground. "I do not need it," he growled, and grabbed Philip. He lifted him up with one hand and pressed him against the cart. "My vows prevent me from killing you." He leaned in close to Philip's face. He took the tip of his sword and sliced open a cheek. Philip shrieked. "If she is harmed in any way, I will find you, and I will make your death slow and weary," Ralph continued. He sliced the other cheek and ignored the screams. "You will beg me to die, and I will not allow it. Not a hand on her, not a cut, not a scratch. Am I understood?" Philip cowered under the glower of the enraged knight. Blood dripped down the front of his coverlet, but he did not dare raise a hand to his cheek. "Yes," he said softly, louder. "Say it." Ralph shoved him against the cart. I will not harm her," answered Philip. Ralph shoved him again and pressed the tip of his sword between the man's legs. "You, no one, no harm shall come to her, or I will unman you right here." Philip squealed and stood on the tips of his toes. "Mark him to remember," Ralph instructed Chaucer. John tried to crab crawl away. I will remember, sir, I swear by God." Chaucer stood back. "I think he will remember, Ralph." Ralph dropped Philip on the ground. He strode over to John and lashed out with his sword. The tip slashed open the man's cheeks, and he screamed. "He will now." Ralph wiped his blade on the squirming soldier's sleeve and sheathed his sword. He took a deep breath and marched past the 5 knights who had gathered to watch them. "You could have sampled her for free," de Troyes teased. Ralph stopped and glared at de Troyes. His hand fell to his pommel, and he struggled to control his breathing. After a moment, he moved off by himself, away from the camp. He stripped off his mail as he walked, then his jerkin. He planted his sword in front of him like a cross, kneeled bare-chested, and bowed his head. His mind was awash with images of Rachel. She grabbed him, her hand on his arm, her fingers that tingled the tiny hairs. He could recall every detail of her, the wash of black hair that fell out of her wrap, a few stray strands loose around her eyes, her bosom that heaved and glistened, her red lips, full, parted, panting. Ralph clenched the sword with white knuckles. His lips raised in silent prayers as he remembered. Chapter 9. The trees pressed in on the sides of a well-worn path. Sunlight slipped through the canopy to cast dappled golden splashes across the colourful woodlands. Birds chirped in the treetops. A horse slowly clopped along. Ralph sat astride the horse. His hair was long and tangled, a beard to his chest. He was dirty, and wearing a filth-encrusted tunic. He looked out of place on the horse with the nice saddle, a broadsword awkwardly perched on his back. He rocked back and forth on the horse as they approached a stream crossing. He pulled his mount to one side and let it drink. While the horse slurped the water, he glanced around and paused as he heard something. Splashes filtered down to him from upstream. Ralph slid off the side of his horse and snuck through the tight underbrush. Several 100 yards from the path, he came upon 2 women bathing in the stream. He stared through the branches at their lithe, naked bodies as they quietly giggled. They climbed out of the stream, and the shorter one donned her simple dress. Ralph leapt out of hiding and knocked them both down. They screamed. He tied the shorter one to a tree and made her watch while he ravished the taller one. When he finished, he released her and let her go. He slashed the bonds, tying the short one to the tree, and stood over her. She begged. He ignored her and kneeled on top of her. Footsteps ran through the underbrush. Ralph stopped as he heard them approach. 4 farmers burst through the tree line with pitchforks and scythes. They rushed him. "Monster!" shouted the first to reach him. Ralph rolled off the woman and picked up his sword. He danced quickly around the untrained farmers, slashed and hacked until the ground ran red with the blood of 4 dying men. The woman tried to crawl away in the muck and mud. Ralph grabbed her by the ankle, dragged her back, and finished. Chapter 10. Back in the present, Ralph prayed under the rising desert sun. His face was sheathed in sweat, his bald pate drenched. His chapped lips moved fervently as his hands gripped his sword blade. Blood dripped from his palms down the blade. Chapter 11. "Richard," said Connaught. He nodded toward the last of the column as it retreated almost beyond view. A small group broke away as they watched and set up a small dust cloud as it marched back toward them. "God grant us mercy," Richard sighed. James led a group of 12 boys, squires and pages, to a standoff with Richard. The boys were armed with sword, shield, and several lances. Most of them looked scared. They shuffled in front of the glare of their masters, except James. He set his feet apart and held his head high, defiant and proud. Richard could not help a thrill of pride for his former ward. "What is this?" he asked. "We missed the caravan," said James. The boy flashed a quick grin. "Turn around," ordered Richard. "We who are about to die salute you." "Do not quote your studies to me," Richard said in a low, seething voice. James refused to back away. He leaned forward, prepared for anything to come. De Troyes clapped Richard on the back. "Thought them too well," he said. William glanced at Richard and whistled in a low, mournful tune. "You might as well let them stay, even if they go now. You cannot be sure they won't return later, at a more inconvenient time. At least this way we can watch them." Richard cast a glance over the motley crew assembled before him, then turned his back on the boys. "Geoffrey, Connaught, organise them. Keep them to the rear, and convince them to go any time." He marched to the rise in the pass, and stood outlined on the horizon as he studied the desert and the unseen approach of the enemy. "You can leave at any time," Geoffrey addressed the boys. "But if you choose to stay, you will do as we say, and die," said de Troyes. "Do not forget that most important detail." "Have we not always done as you say, my lord?" squeaked Paul. Connaught shot him a withering glare. "And the first rule," he said, "is do not speak until spoken to. Now follow me, and stand where I say. Let us try to scare this proxy into submission." Chapter 12. Richard glanced down the length of the pass to the approaching horde. The gap was narrow, and they stopped before entering, but their numbers stretched out into the valley beyond. He swallowed and breathed deep in an effort to control his fear. There were more than 100 men below. The advance guard looked to be 5 times that amount, and with their retinue and supporters, the number swelled to well over 1,000, perhaps 2. If it were not for the narrow walls of the only pass through this range, the army could overwhelm them quickly. "The horde," breathed Chaucer. "Only the advance guard," Richard corrected. "Only 500, Marceau." "Ah," said William. "Only 500, he says. We are 10. "We are 20 now," said Richard, as he cast a sad glance at the group of boys Geoffrey arranged behind them. "Damn Ralph for not taking the squire and page," said Chaucer. "He is worth any 2 of them," said William. "He is worth any 4 of us," Richard said. "If only he would stop praying." Chaucer gripped his sword tightly. "Let him pray," counselled Richard. "He begs forgiveness for all of the souls he's going to send to hell." "And of his own?" asked the scholar. Richard shook his head. "He says it's beyond forgiveness." Chapter 13. Ralph sat on the edge of a camp stool and dressed the wounds on his hands. He did it second nature, the movement so familiar he barely had to pay attention. He watched Connaught arrange the boys into a wall of shield and sword. "Hold it thus," he demonstrated to one of the squires, Leon. "At least then it will look as if you know what to do." "My master taught me to fight," Leon argued. "He taught both of us." Leon nodded toward a small boy named Reynard, who trembled under the glare of Connaught. "He showed both of you the stance?" "Yes." Leon thrust his chin out. Connaught shoved against the boy, but he held firm. Connaught nodded. "Not bad." "De Troyes is the best teacher," Leon said proudly. Ralph leapt up and drew his sword. He ran towards Leon, sword held high over his head. Leon glanced around, confused, scared. He fell away as Ralph plied into him and threw the line. The man shouldered Leon and Paul down and stood over them. The point of his sword danced from face to face. "Is that how you will stand to the Saracens?" he growled. "Ralph, not so hard," chided Connaught. "Will our enemies make it easy?" Connaught held out a hand and helped both of the boys to rise. "You surprised me," Leon muttered. James cringed, and Paul backed away from the arrogant squire. "I surprise you." "I surprise you." Ralph circled the boy like a shark. He was unrelenting and shoved the young man once, twice. "He's not your squire," cautioned Connaught. "He's no one's squire," snapped Ralph. "He was freed this morning, and he chose to return to die beside me. Why?" "For the glory," the boy sputtered. "There is no glory in death. No one will remember your name. The scholar will not compose a poem for you." Leon cast about to his fellow squires and pages, but they were no help. The boy refused to meet his desperate glances. "My master," he started. "You do not have a master," growled Ralph, and shoved him. "Why should I let you fight with me? Can you fight?" Leon glanced at his lance and back at Ralph. "I can fight." Ralph darted in close and pressed the tip of his nose against the boy's. "I do not think you can," he said in a low voice. "I think you are a plaything for the Frenchman. You spent your days curling his hair." Leon slammed his shield against Ralph with a shout. He knocked the larger man back and swung the lance around to spit him. Ralph grabbed the lance and jerked it from his hand. He spun it around in the air and leapt. The boy fell back and drew his sword with a shout. It clanged against the lance. "There it is!" shouted Ralph. "Ralph!" Connaught screamed. Leon hacked away at the lance. Desperation and anger fueled his blows. The other boys backed away and cowered. At the top of the rise, the knights heard the commotion and turned. "Bastard!" yelled de Troyes. He sprinted towards the combatants. "De Troyes!" shouted Richard. "God's mercy! William, stop those fools before the proxy arrives. What kind of front are we presenting, divided thus?" "Ralph only instructs the pup," said Chaucer. "De Troyes wants that privilege for himself," said William as he rushed after. Leon swung the sword at Ralph's head. He blocked the blow, and a feral grin split his face. The knight stepped onto the next swing and knocked the boy to the ground. "Good, good," he said. "That's the face you show our enemy." De Troyes growled as he hurtled towards the knight. Ralph ducked and flipped de Troyes over his back, using his momentum against him. He landed beside Leon and gasped for breath. Connaught moved between the two men and pushed Ralph back. William arrived a second later and added his body between them. "Do you want the Saracens to see that?" He tried to catch his breath. James, Paul and Reynard helped de Troyes and Leon to their feet. De Troyes shoved them off. "Be glad you die here, penitent," he grumbled. "Otherwise, your death would be wasted." "Break away," William advised. "Both of you." "No other instructs my boys," warned de Troyes. "If that's your taste," Ralph said as he walked away. De Troyes jumped after him. Connaught put his body between them again and restrained the knight. "Hold, hold," he said. Leon reached out to his former master and placed a hand on his arm. "He was correct, sire," the boy said. "I could not show a soft face to the heathens, or they would know my fear." De Troyes glanced at the boy, then at the back of Ralph. He turned to Leon and patted his cheek with paternal affection. "Everyone fears, son, even him." "Especially him," said William. "It is why he is so ferocious in battle." He turned to the rest of the assembled boys. "All of you, use your fear. Swallow it, and let it burn in your belly like the fire of righteousness." Chapter 14. A horn sounded from the advance guard. Richard watched as the mass of humanity below them swirled. A small detachment of 50 men broke away and advanced up the pass. Even as they approached, they narrowed into a small column. The other knights joined Richard, arrayed beside him. Ralph and de Troyes stood on the far ends of the line. "They come," said Chaucer. "How poetic," said Geoffrey. "We have eyes," de Troyes sulked. "No one speaks," ordered Richard. "No one blinks. My voice is the only one among us. Are the troops ready?" "Troops, your generosity is overwhelming," William joked. "We stand ready," Connaught shifted. The knights set their faces to stone and watched the colourful entourage approach. Scimitar-wielding foot soldiers surrounded 2 sedans borne on the back of slaves. As the passage narrowed, the Saracens had to move to the front and rear of the sedans, which were as wide as 2 or 3 men. It left little room for soldiers to be on either side. The first Saracen stopped 10 yards shy of the knights and waited where the slaves settled the sedans to the rocky canyon floor. The curtains on the second sedan parted and Ahmed stepped out. He was a tall, thin man with a very pretty face and even crueler eyes. He stepped daintily out of the sedan and shuffled up to the first sedan. A beautiful woman parted the curtain and stepped outside. She glanced at Ahmed and bowed submissively, patiently waiting for his command. He beckoned her forward, and she fell in step behind him. Two slaves rushed forward and flung out a rug, while another set up a stool and pillow within yards of the knights. "Ralph," Richard said, and stepped forward to meet the envoy. "With me." "There is a woman," Chaucer started to say. Ralph stepped forward, his eyes locked on the sword-bearing soldiers behind the envoy. "She is of no consequence," Ralph said softly. Richard glanced over his shoulder at Chaucer. "Only question my decisions before battle, never during." Chaucer nodded. "My apologies." Richard and Ralph stopped at the edge of the rug. Ralph never took his eyes off the soldiers, but his lip twitched as the bewitching scent of the woman stirred on the breeze. Ahmed smiled and barked at her in his native tongue. "I am skilled in your language," she said, "and I will act as your interpreter for this exchange if it pleases you." She did not raise her eyes and barely lifted her head, but her voice was strong and clear. "What is your name?" Richard asked. "Jasmine," she said. The Saracen barked at her in his guttural tongue, and she answered. He smiled at Richard, but it did not touch his eyes. "I see nothing wrong," said Richard. "Continue." She nodded to Ahmed, who spoke to Richard as she translated. "May Allah greet you and keep you well." "God is with us." "Is this your army? 6 old men? It would be dishonorable to kill you," she said. "I am willing to accept your surrender." Richard locked eyes with Ahmed. Jasmine glanced at him in confusion. "Pardon," she said. "Perhaps I did not translate the counsellor properly. He expects your surrender." "As I expect his," answered Richard. She turned to Ahmed and gave him the knight's response. Ahmed glared at her, shouted, and she cringed. He turned to Richard and smiled. Jasmine edged away from the Saracen. She looked at Ralph. "The counsellor, beloved of Allah, says that you look like a mighty warrior, one with sense who will explain to your leader the futility of his refusal." Ralph tore his gaze away from the soldiers and glanced at her. She watched him with moist, pleading eyes. "You will have to find another way around," said Richard. "We will not move from this pass." Ahmed spoke to Jasmine. "We have discovered 2 routes to carry us around," she explained to the knight. "Therefore, your defiance is useless. We will allow you to join your army." "Tell him he's bluffing. The next serviceable pass is 5 days' march from here." She translated, and Ahmed gargled back. "What is 5 days to our horde? So large that it takes a man 10 days on horseback just to ride the perimeter." "Then we will stay," answered Richard, "and you can ride to the next pass." Ahmed screamed at Richard. "We have brought archers!" He shouted at the Saracens behind the sedans. Archers stepped out and raised their bows. They awaited the command to draw and fire. "The counsellor asks who will tell the story once you are dead." Ralph crouched forward and coiled. "Tell him he will be the first to die," he growled in a low voice. Ahmed glanced at Jasmine. She translated. "Tell him his head will roll to the Sultan before the archers can release. Ask him how long the head lives once it's separated from the body. You cannot speak. There is no air. You will not feel pain. There is too much shock, but you will know what happened. You can still see your body and the headless world around you. You are aware of everything for minutes, the longest minutes of your life." As he spoke, his grip on the pommel of his sword grew tighter. White knuckles stood out, and his voice grew louder. Ahmed stared in horror as Jasmine finished translating. He barked over his shoulder, and the archers dropped their bows and slipped behind the sedan. He nodded toward Ralph. "You can stop them now," he said through her, "but not in battle." "I will worry about the battle," said Richard. "You respect the parley." Ahmed sneered at him and shrugged. "Can we reach an agreement?" "Do you agree to leave?" He snorted as she spoke. "It's over," she slumped. "So be it," Richard answered. He spun around and began walking away. Jasmine darted a hand out and grabbed Ralph by the wrist. "Please, sir, I beg your help." He tried to jerk his hand away. She clung tighter. "Do not touch me." "I am a slave, sir, not of this land. Please, I plead to your noble heart. Free me, please." Ahmed jumped off his stool and grabbed her by the hair. He jerked her back away from Ralph and screamed for the swordsman. 3 hustled forward to aid him. Jasmine reached for Ralph again. "Help me," she begged. Ahmed cuffed her head once, twice. She let go of Ralph and fell. His sword made a distinct sound as it whistled from the sheath. Ahmed's head rolled past the swordsman and settled at the foot of an archer. Ralph blocked a thrust from one of the 3 Ahmed asked to help. He shoved the blade through a second. Gower spattered Jasmine as he ripped the blade free and stood over her. 2 Saracens screamed and whipped their scimitars over their heads as they rushed him. Ralph sent 2 more heads rolling among the archers. Ralph danced forward. His sword flashed in the morning sun. The Saracens rallied to fight back, but he swung like a demon, his motion fluid and precise. The furious assault dropped 10 bodies, pumping blood across the stone floor before Richard could reach him. The knight dragged Ralph back, parrying with the flat of his blade against the surprised swordsman as they recovered. Ralph yanked Jasmine by the arm and hauled her with them. "Marchers!" screamed Richard. They reached the 5 other knights and knelt behind a wall of shields. "Sire!" James shouted. He raced forward with Richard's shield and covered his master as the archers lined up their shots. Ralph shoved Jasmine next to Chaucer and covered her exposed body with his. William leaned over to block Ralph with his shield. Arrows rained on top of them in waves of 10. Many overshot the mark and skittered off the ground beside them. Others bounced off the shields. An arrow sank into William's calf. He howled and dropped his shield. "Cover him!" Ralph shouted to Connaught. He lifted William's shield and timed the archer's draw. A smart commander would have had them shooting in a random pattern, but these Saracens were drawing and firing in unison. They shot. He ducked behind the shield. The arrows slammed into the metal or flew past. The archers drew again. Ralph charged the short distance and slammed into them with his razor-sharp sword. Arms fell. Bows sliced in half. De Troyes ran after Ralph and joined him. They lay about with their blades, hacked and hewed the archers. The narrow passage served to their advantage. The Saracens rallied with their swords. Richard and Geoffrey moved into the fray. The 4 knights beat back the line to the first sedan. Leon and James shouted and ran to battle. It was over quickly. The Saracen guard was decimated from 50 to 20 in a matter of minutes. The survivors scurried past the second sedan and rushed down the pass to join the rest of the advance guard. James wiped his blood-spattered blade on the back robe of a fallen swordsman. "Will they return today?" "Let us hope not," growled Richard. "Ralph!" He turned and searched for the knight. Ralph yanked 6 dead bodies off de Troyes and lifted him up. He was battered, blood-covered, and smiled. "Try to steal all the fun," he boomed. "At least I did not take a nap," Ralph shot back. He stalked back to Chaucer and William of the shield wall. 6! It took 6! de Troyes shouted after him. Leon limped over to his master. "I got 2. De Troyes threw an arm around his shoulder and helped him back to the top of the rise. "A glorious start," he congratulated the boy. Richard caught up with Ralph behind the shields. "What were you thinking? We had no strategy. We had no plan. They would not have attacked until morning." "She begged my help." Ralph shrugged towards Jasmine. She pulled away from Chaucer and threw her arms round Ralph. He flinched and tried to pull away, but that only made her cling harder. "Thank you, sir. Thank you," she sobbed. "Are you injured?" he asked. "No, but I am, damn it," grumbled William. Richard went to a knee next to him and examined his wound. A 1-foot shaft protruded from his leg. "It's a scratch," said Richard. Paul ran forward with bandages. "How much time will they give us?" asked Geoffrey. Richard grasped the shaft of the arrow. "This will sting a bit." He yanked it out. William pounded a fist into the ground. Jasmine knelt beside Richard and began to wash the wound and dress it. "They will not be ready until morning," she said to the knights. "Can we trust her?" asked Connaught. "Trust or no," said Richard, "we will be ready now." "You can believe me. I would not betray the man who saved me," said Jasmine. She finished with William and stood next to Ralph. He was very conscious of her and tried very hard not to be. "Gather the shields, all of them," Richard commanded. Paul scurried to comply, and the rest of the pages fell in to help him. "I fear you place yourself into the wrong hands, my lady," said Chaucer. Jasmine rested her shoulder against Ralph's strong arm. She ignored his flinch. "I feel safe with him," she said. "I do not mean our friend," said the scholar. "I mean with us. You should know the odds we face, your chance with us. I would rather live free one day than a lifetime as a slave." She threw her shoulders back. "One day of freedom." "Until morning," she nodded. "What of the counsellor's head?" "I do not pretend to know the ways of war, but in my capacity I sat in on many councils. Their full number have yet to arrive, and they will not attack in half measures." "Half measures?" gulped Connaught. "How many are coming?" "There are 2,000 in the advance guard, 10 more in the horde." The knights glanced at Richard. "How can we stand against 2,000? "We cannot," Chaucer said. "There is time to catch up with the army," said de Troyes. "If they will not attack until morning, that gives us an extra day. Add to that how they will have to squeeze through this passage, and we may add even more days to that." Richard considered them for a moment. He weighed the arguments in his mind. Emotion dictated that they should make a run for it, to catch up to the main body of the army and to live another day. Logic said the fight would still find them on ground less favourable, and with a similar outcome. "You know why we were chosen," he said. "Our duty is this pass, to buy our brothers time to move beyond the reach of this horde. I will not run." He stared at each of them. 2,000, Richard," said William as he tottered to his feet. 100 for each of us." 2,000 minus 30, said Ralph. 99 for each of us then, William amended. It still sounded hopeless. "They can only come at us 10 at a time," said Richard. "We outnumber them 2 to 1. "They have archers." Chaucer picked up an arrow shaft and examined it. Paul and the other pages lumbered up with the shields. "These are all, sire," he said, out of breath. "Let me handle the archers," Richard said. "I'll go to pray," Ralph declared. He marched to the top of the rise and off to one side. Jasmine trailed after him, but kept a respectful distance as he sank to his knees. "What is it with him and women?" asked Chaucer. "Our code burnt into his soul," answered Richard, as he began to direct the pages how to set up the shields. The knights pitched in, and they made short work of it. Chapter 15. Ralph crouched in front of his sword, the impromptu cross casting a long shadow under the morning sun. He bowed his head. Jasmine slid to her knees beside him. They accidentally touched, and she noticed he flinched. "Do I disturb your prayers?" she asked softly. "Do not touch me," he answered. He scrunched his eyes closed and prayed to lose those memories. He remembered a fire in the hearth roaring. The flames cast heat across the room, danced and flickered against the cold. The room was sparse with simple furniture. A table, 2 chairs and a bed pressed up against the wall in the corner. Ralph sat at the table and tore into a chunk of bread. He used it to spoon up stew off a wooden trencher and swallowed it down with a tankard of ale. He smacked his lips when he was done and threw the empty mug into a man's corpse in the corner. Ralph shuffled to the bed in the corner. A woman lay battered, beaten, and dumped on the mattress. He stood over her naked body and leered. With a scarred hand he reached down and spread her knees apart. She lunged at him with a knife. He batted it aside and fell on top of her. She screamed and cried. When he was done, he dressed, slit her throat, and walked back out into the cold. He left the door open. Jasmine leaned against him as he prayed. His body trembled as he clenched the sword harder. Chapter 16. Richard surveyed the work of the pages. The shield stretched across the path, propped up on tripods and staked to the ground. It created an almost solid wall across the pass. He lifted a second shield and held it over his head to duck beneath it. He passed the shield to James. "They will pin us down until we starve," said Connaught. "I am working on that plan." "I may know a way," said the Troys. Leon stood 10 feet away and stared. He trembled in fear at just the sight of the back of the men who kneeled in front of his sword. These knights were sometimes holy men and in a holy war, so what was the penalty for interrupting their communion with God? He stepped forward and squeaked, "Excuse me, sir. My master wishes to speak with you." Ralph turned to glare at him. "Tell your master, I pray. Disturb me again, and I will send you to the Maker." "I'm sorry, sir, but he requires information from the lady." Ralph vaulted up. Leon stumbled back with a small cry. The knight hesitated a moment, then held a hand down to Jasmine. "Lady," he said in a strained voice, and helped her rise. She took his hand to gain her feet, then slipped it back into her robe. "Lead on, boy," said Ralph, and they followed him across the pass. "Is my touch so hideous?" Jasmine asked. "It is not your touch I fear," said Ralph. "It is mine." "I thought, perhaps, it was because I am soiled." "I do not presume." "I could not escape the harem, and I am too afraid to take my own life," she said. "God forgives you, lady," said Ralph. "Who are you not to forgive yourself?" "Do you? Do you forgive yourself?" "Some things are beyond even God." "I am sad for you," she said as they reached the shield wall. The 6 other knights circled around them. "Were your prayers heard?" Chaucer asked. "It is in the telling, not the listening." "I have a way to defeat the archers," de Troyes spoke up. "We are here," said Richard. "If what the lady says is true, and they will not attack until the morning, we have a chance to carry the battle to them." William smirked. "Must I keep pointing out the odds to you?" "We all know the numbers we face," said Connaught. "We are safer here in the pass, where they cannot bring the press to bear." De Troyes ignored their muttering. "Is it true? Will the horde wait until the dawn?" "To the best of my knowledge." "They make no moves to indicate otherwise," answered Richard. De Troyes nodded and smiled smugly at the knights. "Then tonight I will sneak into their camp and disable the archers." "Madness," said William. "Impossible," said Geoffrey. "Idiocy," said Connaught. "How?" asked Richard. De Troyes studied Jasmine for several moments. "She will give me the layout of the camp. She will tell me where the archers will bed for the night." "But I do not know," she said. "I cannot allow it. Surely you must know something." De Troyes turned to her. "Women are not allowed outside of their tents," she explained. "I only glimpsed the camp in pieces." The knights grumbled in disappointment, except William, who glanced at de Troyes and then at Richard. "I may know some little thing," he said. "What little thing may you know?" scoffed de Troyes. "The layout of the camp." "Been there, have you?" chided Chaucer. "How can you know this?" asked Geoffrey. "I made a study of their techniques," said the knight. "I have taught my boys the practice. Bartholomew!" A young, wide-eyed squire pushed between the boys and hustled over to them. "Here, sire," he said, breathless. "Now, tell us, lady, what you do know of the camp." "You cannot go without me." De Troyes shook his head at William. "No one will go," said Richard. "It is a waste of our resources." Connaught held up a placating hand. "We must attempt something, Richard, or we are trapped by their shafts, and our shelter alone is not enough. What do you propose to do once you're in the camp, surrounded by 1,000 of their men?" De Troyes' eyes glinted as he smiled. "Burn their weapons, both bow and arrow. We remove them from the battle plan." "To remove them completely, they must be dead," said Ralph. "He cannot kill outside of battle," said Connaught. "It's our vow." Then I will do so. Ralph faced Jasmine. He tried to hide the tremble in his voice. Tell us how the camp lies. Richard, do not allow this. It is not honourable. It is honourable to die with our sword in hand, not stuck full of quills like a hedgehog, said Richard. De Troyes, Connaught turned to him. You cannot want this. With the second best warrior by my side, I cannot fail, said the giant. Who is the best? Asked Chaucer. Why, I am, of course. Then we cannot lose them both, Connaught argued. We need them for the coming battle. With her help, we can minimise the risk, William countered. De Troyes nodded toward his injured leg. I say again, you will not go. How do you expect to keep up with us? William tried to put weight on his leg. It would not hold, and he fell against Ralph, who held him steady. Resigned, William pushed Bartholomew toward the knights. Then my squire will go in my stead. He is a child, grumbled Ralph. Richard grabbed the scared boy and put his arm around his shoulder. Together they faced de Troyes and Ralph. He is a soldier. All these boys are soldiers today. They will die beside you. Give them that honour. Ralph bowed his head and shook it. He turned and glared at Bartholomew. You will do everything I say, and nothing more. Yes, sir, said the boy. Are we ready then? William asked. The group gathered in close around Jasmine as they developed a plan. Chapter 17. The 7 knights stretched across the pass and studied the seething mass below. Twilight came early to the pass as the sun settled over the edge of the ridge and cast the valley in shadows. Even in the growing darkness, the size of the advance guard was intimidating. There was a constant buzz from thousands of voices speaking in a foreign tongue. Yells, shouts, and screams from thousands of animals. Smoke from fire filled the sky and cast a pall in the air. Richard wondered if they brought the wood with them, or if the advance group just stripped the landscape bare. Are you sure you do not want to pray some more? Asked de Troyes. All night. Who has time for that? Ralph pulled his jerkin over his head and reverently folded it. I thought you were done praying, said Chaucer. I will not wear a white target in the dark, answered Ralph. De Troyes glanced down at his jerkin and quickly pulled it off. Boy, Ralph called to Paul, bring us soot from the fire. Paul rushed off to the fire pit. He scooped up 2 large handfuls of ash and ran back. Ralph dipped his hands into the ash and smeared it over his chainmail. The guard does not wear armour, said Jasmine. We cannot go naked into their midst, groaned de Troyes. They will hear you coming, Richard advised. Ralph and de Troyes shed their meal. Connaught approached from the camp. In his hands he carried 3 blood-stained robes pilfered from the dead Saracen swordsman. If ye insist on this madness, at least dress the part, he sighed. The 2 men and boy donned the robes. Then the knight pitched in and smeared their faces and robes with ash. Jasmine dipped her finger into the ash and wiped it across Ralph's cheek. He almost jerked away, but controlled himself at the last moment. She smiled at him. I will spend the night praying for your safe return. All of you, she said. Thank you for the kindness, said de Troyes. Richard pulled the 3 into a tight huddle. His face looked worried, his brow creased. Do not take any unnecessary chances, he advised. It is all a chance, said de Troyes. Richard put his hand on the back of Bartholomew's neck and pressed his forehead to the boy's. Do everything he tells you. Yes, sir. Richard gripped de Troyes by the forearm and shook, then did the same with Ralph. He knew this mission could be a disaster, but the success of it could buy the rest of them more time. He wanted to go with them, to assist and aid, to fight by the side of his brothers, but he had to protect the others. It was a war within him, the same war he fought in wanting to retreat with the rest of the army, but obeying his duty to the order, to protect, to buy time for the retreat to work. So that others might live, he muttered. He marched to the edge of the shield wall. James, he called. First watch. The squire positioned himself just behind the shield wall. Ralph, Detroit and Bartholomew moved beyond the meagre light cast by their fire and slithered past the dead bodies in the pass. They disappeared from view. "Good luck," the boy called after them. "God speed you." Chapter 18. Richard paced around the small fire in front of his tent. Every few moments he would stop and hunched by the blaze, his eyes glazed from staring at the flames as if they held answers. Then he would be off again, his iron-shod boots wearing a narrow path in the dust-covered stone. Connaught joined him by the fire when he next kneeled. "They will not be back," he said. The commander bowed his head and held a hand over his eyes. He massaged the bridge of his nose and brow as William kneeled to join them. "At least Ralph will eliminate many we would have had to face." "I would rather have him by my side in the morning," said Connaught. The men gathered in silence and prayed, the crackling of the flames the only sound for a few moments. "What now?" Connaught finally asked. "We stand at the pass, as planned," answered Richard. William glanced over his shoulder at the small entourage of boys arrayed around the tents. "Hard enough with 7, he said. "Now we are 5. "You sent your squire to his death," Richard said. "Could we do no less? We fill their absent holes with James, Leon, and the rest." Connaught held up a hand. "It is unfortunate that the Threes could not return with bows for our use." "It is a skill I did not teach my boys," said William. "Nor I," said Connaught. "But Chaucer and Geoffrey are schooled in the art, and passed it on." 4 bows would inflict much damage to their charge, William nodded. "Until the quivers ran empty." "Then we toss the wood on the war fire, and take up sword," William shot back. Richard grasped his arm as an idea struck. "The war fire," he muttered. He jumped up, a man inspired. Connaught leapt up with him and drew his sword, hunting for unseen enemies. "Richard!" "Paul! Leon!" the knight called. The boys hurried over from the tent. Geoffrey, Chaucer, and Jasmine followed in their wake. "Sire," Paul gasped breathlessly, in fear and excitement, "select the 2 smallest pages and bring them to me." Paul spun around and rushed to comply. "And me, sire?" "Send a squire to relieve James, and return with him to me." Leon sprinted to the top of the rise. "Will you tell us your divine madness, Richard?" William jested. "Ralph wants to send the heathens to hell. I will do him one better," said Richard. "I will bring hell to them." Chapter 19. Richard peered over the edge of the shield wall and watched as Mouse and Thomas, the 2 smallest boys among the group, scurried down the pass. Scraping sounds echoed up to him from the darkness below. He heard running and turned to see James and Leon skid to a stop in front of him. They struggled to catch their breath. "We found it, sire," wheezed James. "Take all of the boys," ordered Richard. "Bring all you can carry. Geoffrey, Chaucer, go with them." "I've gone from Knight of the Temple to pack horse in less than an hour," grumbled Chaucer. "You were never much of a knight," Geoffrey nudged him in the ribs. They hurried away with James and Leon. William limped along the shield wall and settled next to Richard. "Will it work?" The commander watched the darkness in the pass below. His gaze travelled out to the low burning campfires in the valley, and then back to the rise behind him. "I think yes," he sighed. "But it does not matter. The activity keeps their minds off the morning. It serves a purpose." "And what to keep your mind occupied?" asked William. Richard nodded below, but kept his eyes wandering as he wondered if they could pull off his plan. Chapter 20. Bartholomew worked very carefully to breathe in through his nose and out through his mouth, just as his master had instructed. He placed each foot carefully as he picked a circuitous route and kept them away from the brightest of the firelight. Shuffling in the darkness was a problem in and of itself, as it made picking the path difficult. He lifted his foot to step forward. Ralph jerked him back by the collar of his robe and held him, so he would not lose his balance. An archer turned in his sleep. Bartholomew had almost stepped on him. Ralph set the boy down and put a hand on his chest, commanded him to stay. The knight kneeled down and slid his dagger from his sheath. He sliced the sleeping archer's throat and held the body as it fell into spasms. When it went still, he stood and put a hand on Detroy's shoulder to pull him in close. Ralph pressed his mouth against the giant's ear. "The bows are yours. The men are mine." Detroy's nodded and slunk away. Ralph shifted his mouth to Bartholomew's ear. "Do not move." Bartholomew nodded. He stood as still as one of the statues he had seen as the army marched through Italy on the way to the Holy Land. Ralph sheathed his dagger and slowly inched his sword out of the scabbard. The silver blade was dulled with ash to deflect the glimmering firelight. He snuck off in the darkness. Detroy's found a pile of bows between groups of sleeping archers. He gathered them in his arm like firewood, one slow piece at a time, and tiptoed next to the fire to lay them down into the embers. He turned away to gather more. The ashwood bows were dry and tender. They quickly caught fire and caused the flames to dance higher, throwing out more light across the camp. Bartholomew watched, but either Detroy's failed to notice or did not care. The boy tried to motion the knight to ensure he saw the fire before it drew attention, but Detroy's did not see him. After a moment's hesitation, Bartholomew crept away on an intercept course. Detroy's leaned to pick up a bow. An archer stirred in his sleep and stood. Detroy sank to the ground and lay down like one of the sleeping men. Ralph saw the movement and froze with his blade hovered over another archer. The half-awake man stumbled away from his group and lifted his robe. He pissed next to Detroy's face. The giant did not move. The archer noticed the growing firelight and turned to spy Bartholomew's creeping shadow. "Me," he muttered in Arabic. The boy froze, but he was outlined by the fire. The archer turned and started to shout. Ralph sprinted up behind him in the shadows. The archer heard his footsteps and spun around, just as Ralph sliced through his neck with his sword. The head thudded to the ground next to Detroy's and rolled against another sleeping body. Bartholomew ran to a stack of bows and scooped up 6. He grabbed quivers and weighed himself down. He turned to run back towards the pass and tripped over a sleeping man. The archer screamed and cursed. "As fast as you can," Ralph growled. Detroy's leapt up and began to kick bows into the fires. He smashed them with his boots. He pitched them toward the flames. He worked to destroy as many weapons as he could. Ralph stayed near him. He whirled around with his sword in one hand and a stolen scimitar in the other. Each blade licked out and ripped open a man or sliced off an arm or head every time he turned. The injured men screamed as the camp came alive around them. Bartholomew struggled with the archer he tripped over. The Saracen dragged himself up the squire's body as they rolled and fought. He wrapped his hands around the boy's throat and squeezed. Bartholomew fought to breathe. His fingers fumbled at his waist as he drew his dagger and plunged it into the man on top of him. The hands at his throat relaxed and he sucked in air. He jabbed the dagger in again and again. The archer gurgled. Blood dripped from his mouth onto Bartholomew's face. The boy screamed. Ralph grabbed Detroy's by the arm. "Get the boys," he shouted. "The archers! We can do no more here." Detroy's bashed an archer as he tried to rise up. The camp erupted around them. Men shouted and screamed orders as they struggled to decipher what was happening. Detroy's rushed toward the squire. Ralph followed him calmly. He lashed out with a sword in each hand, and as he walked, bodies fell. Detroy's reached the squire and hauled him up from under the dead body. He noticed the fallen bows and grabbed them. He drew back to toss them on a fire. "Some of the boys know archery," said the boy to stop him. Detroy's nodded and slung the bows across his shoulders instead. Bartholomew grabbed the rest. 3 swordsmen rushed them. Detroy's shoved the squire behind him and met their rush with his sword drawn. Metal clanged, but the knight made short work of the swordsmen and hewed 2 of them down. Ralph gutted the 3rd as he reached them. "Walk slowly," he instructed. They were just 3 more robed men moving through the camp as chaos reigned around them. Chapter 21. Richard spied 2 small figures as he scurried out of the darkness and sprinted for the shield wall. Beyond them, the advance guard camp was stirring like a hive of ants. Screams and shouts echoed across the rock walls and bounced around. Mouse and Thomas made the shield wall and scrambled over. "Done, sire." Thomas worked to catch his breath. "Good work," Richard said, distracted as he tried to make sense of the noise below and the fate of his brothers. Chapter 22. 8 Saracen swordsmen ran in 2 columns past de Troyes, Bartholomew and Ralph as they made their way through the camp. The last swordsman in line did a double take as he passed de Troyes as the knight hunched to mask his giant frame. The Saracen screamed and pointed. De Troyes yanked his blade free and sliced his throat. The scream had warned the others, and they fell on the knights. De Troyes dragged Bartholomew with one hand and fought with the other. Ralph slashed and danced with the 2 blades. The knights killed many swordsmen, any who came to meet them, but for every one that fell, 3 more awoke and joined the fray. De Troyes relied on his size and the confusion to keep them moving. They fought a running battle to the edge of the camp and up the rise toward the shield wall. Ralph hacked down their pursuers. He was covered in gore and blood and roared a challenge. The swordsmen paused in their rush. De Troyes took advantage and shoved Bartholomew ahead. "Run!" he screamed. Ralph slid down the pass and sliced into the next wave of swordsmen and beat them back. The Saracens slipped on the gore-covered rock as they fought uphill for purchase. De Troyes waited 20 yards behind the knight. He kept fitful watch on the overburdened squire as the boy struggled up the pass with all the bows, torn between protecting him and a desire to join Ralph. Connaught leapt over the shield wall as Bartholomew scrambled out of the darkness. "Be ready!" he screamed. A wave of swordsmen pushed Ralph against the rock wall and shoved past him. They spilled up the narrow passage in a roar of rage. De Troyes spun and sprinted after Bartholomew, steps ahead of the Saracens. Geoffrey and Richard jumped over the shield wall to stand shoulder to shoulder with Connaught. De Troyes caught up to Bartholomew just as the Saracen overtook them. The squire ducked under a blade, but fell under the rush. De Troyes stood over him, knocked aside blades, jabs, stabs. Bartholomew screamed from the ground. He lashed out with his dagger at legs, hands, anything he can reach. A scimitar glanced off de Troyes' head, stunned him. He fell to one knee, still fighting. A swordsman stabbed his blade down, pinned Bartholomew to the ground. The squire gurgled an agonized wail. A Saracen towered over de Troyes, raised his scimitar. He grinned. Ralph loomed up behind him and sliced the man in half. De Troyes struggled to gain his feet, his footing unsure on the blood-sliced rock. The swordsmen surrounded them with shouts and yells. Richard, Connaught and Geoffrey slammed into the Saracens and shoved them back. The knights hacked and jabbed. They stabbed and sliced. They fought in controlled silence, efficient killing machines. The Saracens fell back. Ralph followed them down the pass, both swords twirling. James ran out and grabbed Bartholomew and the bows. He dragged the boy back behind the shield wall. De Troyes fell back with them. Richard and Geoffrey guarded his passage until they were all safe behind the shields. "Ralph!" screamed Connaught. "Ralph!" He glared into the darkness. Chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. He stood among a pile of bodies. Several dozen men chopped and hacked. Muscles twitched in death throes. Ralph walked up the pass in a calm, deliberate manner. He stabbed the point of his sword through moving bodies as he passed to end the suffering of any wounded man. He nodded to Connaught and hopped over the shield wall. Connaught took one last look at the carnage and joined him. Chapter 23. Mouse squealed in terror. The other boys froze and stared at Ralph as he landed on the inside of the shield wall. He was covered in blood and gore. It dripped from his sword and arms to pool on the dust-covered ground. "Are you hurt?" asked Richard. Ralph glanced down at each hand, moved the fingers. 5 and 5. "I will live," he said. He glared at Bartholomew. The squire lay in William's arms and gasped. One hand was pressed hard to his stomach, holding tight to prevent anything from spilling out. William rubbed his face. "He died like a warrior," said Ralph. William nodded. He held the boy tight as he whimpered his final breath and went still. De Troyes held up one of the bows. "He insisted we bring these." Renard bound a gash in his arm with a strip of cloth. James took the bow from de Troyes and passed it to Geoffrey. He gathered the rest to pass around. "It was my idea," said James. "He might have lived otherwise." James hung his head. "Do not think like that," said Richard. He clapped James on the shoulder. "He died as we all might, fighting as a man." "How many will we face tomorrow?" asked Connaught. He looked to Jasmine as she stood at the edge of the small group and stared at Ralph. She had a mix of revulsion and fascination on her face, but she dared not move any closer. "I count for 31, said Ralph. "I for 10, said de Troyes. "I did not count the swords." William dragged Bartholomew's body off to one side and covered him in a cloak. "What is their normal contingent?" "They usually travel with 100, said Jasmine. "So we face little more than half," said William. "Not so good as we might have done, but better than we were," said Geoffrey. "I will account for the rest," answered Richard. He turned towards Ralph. "Will you clean the gore off, or wear it like a badge?" "Clean it before you stink," said Geoffrey. "It's too late for that," Chaucer said in jest. Ralph sighed and shifted. Now that the battle heels had faded, he felt the soreness, the aches and pains that always followed desperate fight. He limped over to the fire and a pot of water that bubbled on the stones around it. He grunted as he plopped down on a stool and tried to ignore Jasmine, who followed in his wake. "Are any other wounded?" she asked. He could not raise his eyes to meet hers, and shook his head instead. He fumbled with a piece of cloth and dunked it in the pot. He wiped away some of the blood from his face. Jasmine knelt beside him and took the rag from his hands. She slowly moved the rag across his face and cleaned him off, then to his neck and arms. Ralph trembled under her touch. He squeezed his eyes closed tight. His lips raced in fervent prayer. "Are you badly injured?" she whispered. "No," he grunted. "Then why do you tremble?" she asked. "You are afraid of me?" "Yes." "I would not hurt a noble heart as yours," she said. "How can you fight so ferociously, yet be so kind to me?" She opened the robe. Ralph hissed. There were dozens of cuts across his chest and arms, crisscrossed over a network of ancient scars that told of a hard life. "Stop," he begged. "Be still," she hushed him. She wet the rag and ran it over his torso. "Why did you choose to free me?" she said after a moment. "You asked." "Who could have refused?" He caught her hand in his and held it away from his body. "Why do you want to die here?" She gently grasped the hand holding her arm and pulled it closer to her. She ran the rag up and down his battered forearm. "One day of freedom is worth a lifetime of slavery," she said. "I will die free. You knew I would die, yet you saved me." "I cannot save myself," he said. "So you save others in your stead." "Do you believe in hell?" he asked. "Is it part of your religion?" "Yes," she answered, as she continued to clean him. "I know I'm going to hell, but I want God to know I'm sorry for it." She moved the rag back to his scarred face. Her tender fingers traced the old damage as she washed the blood away. "Allah is very forgiving." Her soft voice mesmerized him. "Perhaps he will rescue you." "It is too much work to ask," he sighed. "Allah is infinite. God is infinite. So much in common, these two," she said. "There, I believe you will live." She dropped the rag into the bloody water. They stared at each other in the flickering firelight. His fingers clenched into strong fists, and a vein popped out on his neck. He stood abruptly. "As will you," he growled. He took her hand and pulled her across the canyon. Richard observed Geoffrey and Chaucer and their squires as they examined the bows and set the arrows up for quick and easy access. Ralph stalked up to them, with Jasmine in tow. "Who among you is the most virtuous knight?" Ralph asked in a low voice. No one answered him. "Which of you can be trusted with a mission of the utmost importance?" James glanced around at the knights and boys. He swallowed hard and stood. He had to clear his throat to say it. "I am ready to die." His confession gave courage to the others. One by one they stood with him. Each boy rose to his feet to make the declaration. "As am I," said Leon. "Me too," squeaked Paul, as he glanced at the shroud-covered body of Bartholomew at the edge of the firelight. Ralph nodded and smiled a vicious grin. "We are all ready to die," he said. "Who is prepared to live?" Richard moved away from the shield wall and stood between Ralph and the group. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "Who will lead this lady to safety? Who will sacrifice his pride for honour?" Ralph moved his gaze across the assembled group and paused on Leon. "You take her," the boy suggested. "I cannot," said Ralph. "I am the best fighter here. For me to leave would mean a quicker death for you all." "My master is a great warrior," argued the squire. "But he will not leave, because I need him by my side. Together we are demons." Leon glanced around. "Sir William is injured. Let him go." "We need his wisdom," said Ralph. "Then James." "He is not good enough to leave." "2 pages cut." "You," commanded Ralph. "I will not. I cannot leave my master. We need every man here." "You and—" Ralph's gaze roamed over the boys again and settled on Paul. You too will volunteer for this most important mission." Paul's eyes grew wide as he glanced at Richard. "I will not go," argued Leon. "You are the best fighter among the squires," Ralph answered. "I need you to protect her, and the boy will be your squire." Leon opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out as he realized he had just been named a knight. He gave a beseeching look to Detroit, who beamed. "Can he do that?" "A battlefield commission and a quest. Today is a glorious day," the giant's voice boomed. "It is night, Detroit," said Chaucer. Ralph turned to Richard. "Will you do this?" The knight glanced at the shield wall and back at Ralph. He thought about Paul, his young page who had defied his orders to leave and returned to fight by his side. This slave woman who defied a horde for one day of freedom, and he thought about the man in front of him. His tortured soul bent on destruction and death. His mission to wreak as much havoc and sow mayhem. A bad man, unforgiven, who stood in front of him now and asked Richard to grant mercy and life to these 3. He turned to Leon. "Kneel," said Richard. The boy fell to his knees in front of the knight. Paul rushed forward and wrapped his arms around Richard. "Master, no," he cried. "I do not want to leave." Richard placed both hands on his shoulders and gently pushed him down. "I am your master, no more," he said. "Do you agree to all of the precepts of the knighthood, namely virtue, poverty, chastity, and devotion to the one true Lord?" "I swear," said Leon. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. "Do you accept the charges before you, to take this squire and teach him as you were taught, protecting him as a son, and grooming him for knighthood?" "Master," said Paul. "I swear," answered Leon. "You are charged with delivering this lady to safety, giving your life for hers if necessary. Do you swear?" Leon hesitated. "It's a devil's bargain, boy," said Ralph. "To become a knight, you must leave us." Leon glared at him. He looked around the circle of faces. The knights stared back at him, pride evident in their faces. The other squires looked on him with envy. He settled on Detroit, the man who had been his master for the past 9 years. The knight was smiling and crying at the same time. Leon felt his chest swell. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "I swear," he said. "You may rise, Sir Leon." Richard paused. "Detroit," shouted Detroit. "Sir Leon Detroit, you are the closest I will ever come to a son." "Sir Leon Detroit," finished Richard. Leon stood. The knights gathered around him and clapped him on the shoulders and hugged him. Jasmine leaned in close to Ralph and whispered in his ear, "I will not leave you." "You will not, my page," said Ralph. "You will live." "But you could use the help," she argued. Ralph raised his voice so the others can hear him. "With our 4 bowmen, we have an advantage we did not have prior. If they shoot true, we will not miss these 2. "But they will be missed," said the Troys. The giant hugged Leon to his massive chest. "Father," the new knight stammered, "on my horse there is a seal. All that I own is now yours." "Right down to his dirty underwear," said Chaucer. I give the majority of my belongings to the Brotherhood, de Troyes continued, but the seal will gain you access to my family and holdings. I would stay and fight by your side, grumbled Leon. I am so proud of you, de Troyes grinned. Everything we have worked for has come to pass. I will die a happy man. Leon blinked away the tears in his eyes. Richard hugged Paul. Learn much, he instructed. He is different from me. Use us both to make you stronger. Must I go? Paul sniffed. Yes, and now, said Richard. Go quickly, go quietly, and go safely. Leon held out his arm to Jasmine. Ralph pushed her away. She took several steps, then darted back to him and kissed him. I will never forget you, she said. She turned and took Leon by his arm. The three of them fled across the rise and disappeared into the darkness as they chased after the retreating army. Chapter 24. As if signalled by the departure, horns sounded from the advance guard in the valley below. Swordsmen fell into formation. The sound of 1,000 feet marching echoed off the canyon walls. Enough ceremony, said Connaught. Can we just concentrate on our dying? Joked Chaucer. Richard fell in beside Ralph as the knights marched to the shield wall. The page is my son, he said. I would have sent both, answered Ralph. Leon is a better warrior. I know, nodded Richard. I am grateful to you for even the one. He clasped Ralph's forearm as they shook hands. Will you tell us now? Asked Geoffrey. Why tell when I can show? Said Richard. At dawn. The anticipation is killing us, Chaucer said. Richard flashed a feral grin. Wait until you see what it does to them. The 7 knights lined up along the shield wall and stood like sentinels. They stared down at the advance guard as the sun tipped over the horizon and sprayed sunlight across the valley. A couple of the young pages gasped. Mouse dropped his shield to the ground with a clatter. Steady, boy, said Richard. Sorry, sir, said the boy as he picked it up. The advance guard was arrayed below. Nearly 2,000 robed soldiers, swordsmen, cavalry, and now minus 30 archers. What now, Richard? The dawn has come. Where is our surprise? In time, Richard said. Are you purposely trying to be cryptic, or is that your normal tone? Chaucer chided. A page named Kit stood next to William. He was impossibly young, just over 10 years old, and should have been back with the caravan. Will we wait long? William studied the manoeuvres of the Saracens. An hour, no more. Are you certain? This is war night. Nothing is certain, William cringed. My apologies, Richard. The waste of youth has me in knots. He patted Kit on the head. Apologies are not necessary, my old friend. But given, nonetheless, this is the first fight where I must worry about someone other than myself. Do not fear for me, sire, piped up Kit. His saucer-white eyes spoke to a fear that was almost crippling. He should fear for you, young Kit, said Chaucer, as we all fear for our charges. None of you tested, yet who stand by our side. Who can question your bravery? You choose to fight with us, when so many other men ran away. We fear the loss of that courage. Pretty words, poet, said Geoffrey. I hope it is enough, Ralph said under his breath. Faith, men, Richard called. We stand fast against all they throw at us. And they are throwing everything they can, said Chaucer. Chapter 25. The advance guard lined the bottom of the narrow canyon pass and stretched out across the valley. Hard-eyed men glared with hatred of zealots at the shield wall that blocked their passage between the rock walls. They were loosely organized. 10 men lined up shoulder to shoulder, 5 deep in the first wave that waited to mount the assault. There were 60 archers remaining, and these stood apart from the front line. At a word from a Saracen general, the archers picked up their bows and jogged to the front of the soldiers. The first 2 rows kneeled, and the next 2 rows stood. In a practiced, synchronized move, they all raised their bows. At the shield wall, William shifted. His eyes squinted as he studied the archers. Your plan, Richard, if you please. Richard watched the archers as well. They laid arrow to bow and drew with a taut thrum. Richard motioned a hand to Chaucer's young page, Abel. The boy dipped the tip of an arrow onto a bowl of coal and lit it on fire. He drew the bow full and released it. A lone arrow arched up toward the wall of archers. It thudded into the ground a dozen yards short of the mark. The archers laughed as the flame sputtered in the still canyon morning. The ground ignited in a trail of flames. It raced across the rock toward the archers. They scrambled up and back, but the flames roared through their line. Men screamed as fire consumed them. Burning archers fell against and into the front line of soldiers, who fell back against the press of bodies behind them. The fire spread across the rock under the soldiers. Men yelled, collapsed and tried to escape. Oily smoke filled the entrance to the canyon. The shouts of the general went unheeded or unheard as men died in burning agony. "More fire!" shouted William. A small cheer went up from several squires and pages as the front line fell back and collapsed on itself. "Press the attack," Ralph growled. "Not through the fire," Richard cautioned. Ralph thrummed with rage and excitement. "We do not have the luxury of time." Richard held a hand up to wait. He studied the flames, studied the confusion as the fire quickly burned out on the rock with no tinder to keep it going except the burning of cloth and flesh. "Chaucer, Geoffrey, Connaught, go with Ralph." Ralph hopped the wall and sprinted down the pass. "Who is in charge?" asked Connaught. "No one leads, you fool," barked William. "Just return alive." Connaught hesitated a moment, then leapt into action behind the other knights. They ran to join Ralph as he smashed through the flames and ripped into the line of soldiers. "Damn it, man," de Troyes shouted down in encouragement. Ralph hacked and hewed. His sword slipped and slashed through arms, necks and bodies. He moved quickly, darted in and under and around, using the smoke and fire and fear to his advantage. The soldiers screamed and shouted. They tried to rally. Then Chaucer hit them. Geoffrey piled in, and the knights sowed hell. The smoke-stained archers fell in droves. The panicked soldiers screamed and died. Connaught came in fast, his sword like a scythe as he mowed down Saracens. The knights shoved the line further back, and further back still. De Troyes bounced on his toes as he stared down at the fight. A scimitar slammed into Chaucer's shoulder and knocked him aside. De Troyes leapt over the shield wall and pounded down the pass into the fray. He slashed over to a dazed Chaucer and past him. Soldiers fell before his sword, sliced in half. Heads rolled back towards the advance guard. Bodies heaped against the side of the canyon. It made footing treacherous. Geoffrey slipped in the gore. The general shouted orders and the advance guard rallied as the flames sputtered out. Swordsmen poured up the pass toward the fighting knights. "Archers!" Richard shouted. 4 pages, Abel, Julius, Thomas and Frog stood up behind the shield wall and raised their bows. "Choose carefully," William yelled. Abel drew his bow and took careful aim. A sword-bearer threw himself on Ralph's blade and dragged it down. A second leapt up and raised his blade to slash the knight's head. An arrow jutted into his throat. He gurgled and fell. Another swordsman jumped on top of his fallen comrade while Ralph jerked his blade free. He spun and hacked both legs off. De Troyes grabs Ralph by the jerkin and pulls him back up the pass. The knights hack and fight a slow retreat to the relative safety of the shields. The next wave of Saracens paused at the entrance to the pass. Bodies littered the ground, stacked 2 or 3 deep in places. Limbs and gore painted the desert black and red as the sun burned mercilessly in the sky. Chaucer rested against the inside of the shield wall. "Do we have time for a nap?" His breath was heavy as he struggled to catch it. "Nap later," William advised. "Once they take your head. Then I will nap forever." "They come," shouted Connaught. The Saracens advanced up the pass. 10 men across as before, but fewer deep in the next wave. The pages rained arrows straight down into the advancing line. Men were pierced and fell. Their fellow soldiers just stepped over the twitching body and kept moving forward. The swordsmen crashed into the shield wall. Bodies poured over the top and edges. William was surrounded by 4 Saracens. They howled as he attacked. He parried 2 blows, but 2 more landed. He fought against them, but their press overwhelmed him, and he fell. Chaucer and Geoffrey planted their backs together, hacked and sliced the invaders. A scimitar sliced across Reynolds' belly, spilled his insides. He cried and fell. The Troy stood over him and beat the swordsmen back as they approached. He lopped off the head of one and sliced a second in half on the return stroke. Bodies fell. Richard and Connaught stood shoulder to shoulder, and waves of screaming Saracens washed up against them like waves against stone cliffs. Blood sprayed across the walls, across the shields. The knights' white jerkins were drenched red, hiding the Templar cross under a stain of Saracen blood. James, Luke and Mouse fought against one wall and held their own. Ralph danced among the press like a whirling dervish. His sword stung through the air and every swing toppled a man. He bashed his way across the line of swordsmen. Abel shot arrow after arrow until his quiver ran dry. He used the bow as a club and smashed it into the head of one Saracen, then another. A third slipped in behind him and skewered the boy. Blood dripped from his mouth as he tried to scream. Ralph lopped the arm off a swordsman. He gripped it in his left hand and used it to beat a Saracen in the head and jabbed his sword through another. He roared in rage, slashed, gouged. Richard and Connaught slashed through the men to reach Ralph. The battle ebbed as the knights winnowed the Saracen numbers down. Ralph rolled over the edge of the shield wall and battered his way into the lines of the swordsmen as they began a slow retreat. He stalked them halfway down the pass, jabbed and slashed the men in the back, hacked through them, until the wave passed out of the canyon and into the safety of numbers below. Ralph spied the Saracen general, and the two men locked eyes. The general smiled, taunted the knight to come further. Ralph turned and marched back toward the shield wall. A wounded archer crawled in the bloody muck and dust. Ralph stabbed down and pinned him to the ground. He moved among the wounded Saracens as he walked back, killed them all. Richard leaned against the shields. He was covered in blood, most of it not his own, though a gash on his arm leaked down his muscles. He struggled to catch his breath as he studied the mass of the advance guard that milled about the entrance of the canyon. The pass was full of dead Saracens. He turned to look at the damage behind the meagre protection of the shield wall. De Troyes wept over Reynolds' lifeless body. Chaucer and Geoffrey slumped back to back as the poet wrapped a cloth around a wound in his leg. "We made a good show," gasped Connaught. Behind them, a man wheeled in Arabic. It was cut short with a thwack. Ralph pushed against the shield wall. "Richard," he gasped. "Richard!" Richard snapped out of his reverie. "Take their dead and make a wall," he ordered. "William is gone," Ralph told him. Richard sighed and bowed his head. There was no time for sorrow. "Pile the dead in a wall," he said again. "Give the bastards something to climb." Ralph nodded. He grabbed a body by the robes and hauled it halfway down the pass again. "And our dead?" Connaught asked. "Help Ralph," said Richard. He moved to de Troyes. Connaught glared at his back for a moment, then grabbed a swordsman's body and tossed it over the shields. He repeated for the next. Richard placed a bloody hand on de Troyes' shoulder. "Move him further back," he said softly. The giant lifted the small body of the boy and carried it gently back to the tent. James stood over the gashed and broken bodies of Mouse and Luke. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. He glanced up at Richard and blinked back tears. "I am glad you survived," said Richard. "Luke was 2 years my elder," said the boy. "Too young." "Are not we all?" said Chaucer as he limped up. "We are short an archer." He nodded towards Abel. "I am sorry. Abel was a good boy. He would have made an excellent knight. He died a knight's death." Chaucer bowed his head a moment. "Thank you. We fought well." He stared at the carnage. "Do we know account?" "Ralph keeps the toll," answered Richard. "Will they come again today?" James asked as he stared down the pass. Richard followed his gaze to the swelling numbers of the advance guard that gathered at the entrance. "I think they must." Chapter 26. The knights laid out the bodies of their dead behind the small tents in their camp. William, Reynard, Abel, Luke and Mouse were set upon the hard rock ground and composed with arms on chest or by their side. James did his best to wipe the drying blood from at least their faces, but Richard advised to save the water for thirst and not cleanliness. "Besides," added Chaucer, "there will be no one left to clean us up." Richard gave a small prayer. He left some of them there, with their heads bowed, and went to the small fire to tend a pot of tea. 237, said the Troys. "Some I could not count," added Ralph. "Not enough fingers and toes," chided Chaucer. "Too far down the pass." "Lighten up, Ralph," said the poet. "We are dead men, and as such, we have much more room for humour." "A damn fine show," said Kenalt. "This battle will live forever in history." Richard poured hot water into his cup and swirled the dregs. "We will be forgotten," he spoke softly. "How can you say that?" asked Chaucer. "No one has seen such a story since Thebes." "Who of us will remain to tell it?" asked the commander. "Our story will never be told. History lies in the hands of the victors, and despite all we do today, we will not be victorious. All that will matter is the Saracen horde is delayed in this defile because of the narrowness of the passage, not for the actions of a few knights of the temple." "I think you are mistaken," Ralph said gruffly. "We will give them reason to talk of us." "The Saracens respect bravery," added Chaucer. "They will talk of this day." "I do not want their respect," growled Ralph. "I want their fear." "If any one of us could gain their fear, it is you," said Geoffrey. He stared at Ralph thoughtfully. Richard noticed his gaze. "Do you have something in mind?" "Several somethings," said the knight. "Send the boys for every weapon they can scavenge." Richard nodded to James. The squire motioned for Kit, Thomas, Julius, and Frog to join him. They hopped over the shield wall. "How do we make them wait?" asked Geoffrey. "We cannot," said Richard. "We will not," said Ralph. Geoffrey drew his sword and slid it under his arm. He turned to demonstrate to the men assembled around the fire how the blade jutted from his back. "We will give them a wall of razors to climb." Chapter 27. The boys laid the last of the gathered weapons in a pile at Ralph's feet. He stood in front of a wall of dead Saracens' bodies, stacked like cordwood across the pass. It made a grisly, gruesome wall, nearly 6 feet tall and 2 or 3 feet deep. Blood leaked across the wall of bodies and dripped down the pass. Even this far out in the hot desert, flies and insects buzzed in a numbing hum around the carnage, just as carrion birds circled the thermals in the sky. Ralph picked up a scimitar and plunged it through the wall. 6 inches of blade ripped through the gore on the other side. Ralph worked quickly. James and the other boys joined him. At the shield wall, Chaucer inspected the fletching and points of scavenged arrows. He passed the good ones to Thomas and Frog, and the broken ones to James to carry to the wall. "1 man, 1 shot," the knight instructed the boys. "As they top the wall, take careful aim." Richard marched down to Ralph with Kenalt, and sniffed at the disgusting barrier they had erected across the pass. "This should give them pause," said Kenalt. Richard stood on the robed leg of a man and peered over the wall of dead. Blood-covered sword tips jutted from the bodies, hidden in the gore and gristle and shadows. "Would it you?" Richard asked. "Richard, if I came upon this in battle, I think it would not only give me pause, but cause to reconsider that the men I fought against were insane." "Who says we are not?" 7 against the Saracens, aye," said Kenalt. "It was an insane notion. Good title for a poem, though." "I shall tell the poet." Kenalt glanced at the wall. "We may want to tell some parts a little differently, if it works." "Will it hold them all day?" said Richard. "No. Will it slow them enough that we can handle the flow? God is with us. And Ralph." Kenalt nodded and glared at the knight as he made adjustments to several scimitars on the far end of the dead wall. "He thought well to come up with this. You should like him more. He has saved all of our lives, more than once." "I cannot," said Kenalt. "Because he is not a traditional knight of the order." "He is no knight. He is a killer." "You kill," countered Richard. "I kill in battle, not for pleasure." "He is contrite." "But he still loves it," said Kenalt. "Do you see him in battle? He grins like a madman. He enjoys it." "You hold too much against him." "There is more, a better reason perhaps. My page came to me when his parents were slaughtered, his father gutted, his mother violated by a marauder. That man was Ralph. Before he came to God. Has he told you of his past? Have you? Have any of us? Richard argued. Our vows require us to forget the past and seek redemption. We tell no one of who we were before. And with good reason, said Connaught. If the truth were known, no man would stand with him. Except me. I would stand with him. You do not speak the truth. No, I do. Like the history of this fight will be tainted by the victors, so do we taint the view of ourselves. We are not as pious or as virtuous or as anything we remember ourselves to be. It is human nature. None are as bad as Ralph. Why? Asked Richard. Because he acted on base impulse most men pretend not to have. Ralph is what he is, a warrior, and a warrior's job is to kill. What else he was before this war we find for him is for God to judge, not I, not you. He has asked for forgiveness. Connaught ducked his head. He does kill well. I would rather have him here than not, Richard said. Me as well, though I cannot forgive his past. It is not your place. That belongs to another. He would know better than me. Horns sounded behind the dead wall. To me, Richard called, and stepped closer to the shield wall. The space between was swept clear of bodies and weapons, though the ground was stained with ichor and blood. The knights and their charges gathered around Richard. He nodded to Ralph. We cannot show ourselves on top of the wall of dead, or the archers will pick us off. One has tried to take my head once, as we will theirs, grunted Chaucer. We stand below, Ralph instructed. Take weapons from any who fall, and shove it through wall. Save the arrow, if you can. Add the body to the pile. We have become the undertakers, said Chaucer. What should we care, added Geoffrey. We have been dead for days, just too dumb to know it. Richard motioned the knights forward. Chaucer and the boy archers hopped behind the shield wall and held their bows ready for what was to come next. Behind the dead wall, the boys shifted nervously and fidgeted. How will we know when they are here? Asked Kit. Ralph closed his eyes and leaned closer to the dead bodies. Listen, he said. The buzz of flies was an ever-present hum, but below that was a pounding sound. It grew in volume like the thundering of 100 drums. The ground beneath their feet trembled. The first of the Saracens sprinted to the dead wall and leapt. They scrambled for purchase, grabbing arms, legs, anything they could for a handhold. Tortured screams and howls echoed across the rocks as soldiers fell off the wall, hands and feet lacerated. The second wave stomped over the first, pressed the men into the dead wall, and impaled them on the slivers of blood-covered blades. They climbed over the impaled bodies and ignored the screams. Ready the archers, Ralph called. Richard motioned to Chaucer. Every arrow finds a mark, the poet said to the boys. He kneeled to one knee, drew the arrow to his ear, and waited. A Saracen clambered over a companion to top the wall. He shouted in triumph. An arrow slammed through his open mouth and pitched him backwards into the scrum. Damn, said Chaucer. Excellent aim, sire, Thomas shouted. I wasted an arrow. Go for the gut, boys. Let Ralph finish those who fall. A second swordsman topped the wall, then a third. Arrows sprouted from their stomachs. They fell to the waiting knights below. Richard stepped to one of the soldiers, stabbed him through the head. He kicked the body close into the dead wall, grabbed the arrow and tossed it back toward the archers. Ralph leaned over, picked up the fallen sword, and jammed it through the dead wall. The blade ripped through a body and stabbed a Saracen in the face. Good plan, said Richard. Ralph did not hear him, or if he did, cared not to listen, as he stared at the top of the wall and longed to jump over it. Thomas let his last arrow fly. I am out. Chaucer dropped his bow and pulled his sword. Finish my stack, he said, and hopped over the shields. He ran to join the knights by the dead wall. A gut-shot swordsman fell beside him. He jammed the point of his sword through the man's throat. We are down one stack of arrows, Chaucer called. Geoffrey leaned over and plucked the arrow from the Saracen and tossed it on a pile of arrows. 50 down, said Geoffrey. 75 more. Thomas scooped up the pile of arrows and raced back to the shield wall with them. Let some of them come over, growled Ralph. He practically vibrated with excitement and rage. Each time a boy stabbed one of the fallen, he snarled as if angry that the opportunity was not his. "He could use the exercise," advised Troyes. "How much longer can they keep this up?" 1,650 more, said Geoffrey, "give or take." A Saracen collapsed by Ralph. He hacked the soldier's head off, took his sword and arrow, and threw the head over the wall. "They will pull back for the afternoon," he said. "We may have bought another day." "Did you study under William too?" sneered Connaught. "I wish I had. My plans could be more fine-tuned." "Your plan has worked thus far. Our others will work as well." He sliced a soldier that pitched off the wall, recovered his weapon. "You bought us time," said Richard. "Thank you." Ralph bowed and waited for the next body. A whistle cut through the canyon. Chaucer saw Thomas wave both hands in the air. "Out of arrows so soon?" asked Geoffrey. "No more top the walls," said Chaucer. The knights stepped away from the walls. It was true. No more men tried to climb over, though they could still hear the presence of bodies on the other side. "Are they withdrawing?" "I will check." Ralph grabbed a body and sawed the head off. He stuck it on the end of his sword and lifted it up over the dead wall. He slowly twisted the dead eyes left and right. "I cannot see a thing," he snarled. Chaucer cackled. "It was funny. I have said it all along. Ralph has a tremendous humour. Gallows humour, but humour nonetheless." An arrow glanced off the side of the head and skittered off the wall in a ricochet. Another arrow plopped into the eye of the head. "My eye!" called Ralph. A second arrow thunked into the other eye. "My other eye!" Ralph pulled the head back down and plucked out both arrows. He tossed him into the pile and chucked the head over the wall to bounce along the advance guard. Howls and shouts greeted the landing. "They stalk us, as we do them," said Richard. "But no more come over the wall?" asked Chaucer. "We wait until nightfall," said Connaught. "Can you execute your plan while we wait?" Ralph considered for a moment and nodded. "Some." "Do what you can now," ordered Richard, "but be prepared to drop all and come to our aid." Ralph took to Troyes, Chaucer, James and Kit with him back to the shield wall. Chaucer motioned toward the Saracens on the opposite side of the wall. "What do you think they're doing?" "They are trying to find a way over," said Richard, "and when they do, it will be terrible." Chapter 28. The eyes of the dead clouded over quickly. There were no more signals to the tear ducts to keep them moist. Dust and grit that is normally washed to the side settles onto the eyeball to give it a cloudy appearance. It did not matter. The dead cannot see. A Saracen head, with his mouth twisted in a permanent scream, nodded back and forth in the dead wall. It pitched forward and bounced off a leg below and continued to roll for several yards. Richard peered through the newly created peephole. "What do they do?" Connaught asked him. "Nothing," he answered. The pass below was empty of live bodies. It was littered with the detritus of battle, bloodstains and fallen weapons, but the dead on the far side of the wall had been dragged back down to the canyon. The camp of the advance guard in the canyon looked normal. Guards were posted across the mouth of the pass, but beyond them it looked as if the Saracens were done with battle for the day. "A trick?" "Damn William," breathed Richard. "Why did he have to let himself be killed?" "I am sure he would have willed it otherwise," said Connaught. Richard pulled his face away from the hole in the wall. "I do not know what tactic they will take. I do not know how to respond." "We fight," said Connaught. "Perhaps we die. James." Richard waved the boy over. "Sire." "Keep watch through the hole. Let us know when they move." James cast a glance at the putrid dead wall and scrunched his nose. "Aye, sire." "Ignore the stench." Connaught clapped him on the shoulder. "She'd be easy," James shot back. Connaught followed Richard back to the shield wall. De Troyes and the others waited for their approach. "News?" "They do nothing. More accurately, they prepare the camp for the night," Connaught added. "With William gone," groaned Richard, "we have no way to know what to expect." Kit cleared his throat and took a tentative step forward. "Excuse me, sir. I know." "William taught you?" "Every day, sir. My instruction included the tactics, history and strategies of the heathen enemy." "What do you remember?" Richard rounded on the boy. "I always did well on the exams, sire," Kit said eagerly. "I remember a lot." "This is most excellent." Richard grabbed the boy on the shoulder and presented him to the knights. "Can we trust the boy?" asked Connaught. "You trust him to fight with you. Go on, boy. Tell us what you know." He opened his mouth to speak and squeaked, "They will attack in the morning." "Once again," coached Richard. "Slowly." "In the morning," said Kit. "They will attack in the morning." "That is it," scoffed Connaught. "That is the insight into their tactics." "Easy, Connaught," grumbled the Troyes. "It is enough." "Do you know why they wait?" asked Richard. 2 companies of archers ride with the advance guard. We only attacked the forward company. They will bring the rear archers to bear on us, and it takes them that amount of time to reach us." "Archers again," sighed Geoffrey. The knights traded glances. The first company had cost them William and 4 of the boys. A second round of arrows would pin them behind the shield wall, or trap them between the dead wall and their shields. Richard had used all of the pitch against them in the first attack. He marched to the top of the rise and searched for Ralph among the trees on the far side. He watched him dart among the trunks, moving with purpose. "Let's hope your faith in Ralph is well pleased," said Connaught from behind him. Richard kept his agreement, silent. Chapter 29. Ralph trudged back into camp. He dragged a giant branch in the dirt behind him. Swords were lashed to the wood with vines in a shape that roughly resembled the letter L. "There are more to carry," he informed Richard. Richard passed him a cup of tea, and Ralph quaffed it. Thomas, Kit and Frog ran across the rise and ran into the woods to retrieve the bundles he had mentioned. "What will you have us do?" Richard asked. "Follow," Ralph grumbled. He directed the men who kneeled between the shield wall and dead wall and scraped earth with their helms. Thomas, Kit and Frog limped up to the shields as they struggled under the weight of their burden. Ralph motioned them to follow him to the dead wall. Ralph whispered instructions into Kit's ear. The boy blanched and nodded. He climbed the bodies of the dead and perched next to James. Ralph and Thomas clambered over the wall. Thomas stopped halfway down the other side and hooked a leg through the stiff arm of a dead man. He clung to the wall precariously. James passed a branch to him. Thomas lowered it to Ralph. The knight snuck down the pass and disappeared into the darkness. Thomas stared into the night. He heard scraping noises from the camp, shouts and the rumble of 1,000 voices in low conversation. Ralph plopped up beside him. Thomas drew a breath to scream. Ralph slipped a hand over his mouth, shook his head and glared. Thomas breathed out. Ralph took the second brand and slipped away again. Kit passed 2 more branches over the wall to James, who passed them down to Thomas. Chapter 30. Richard rested with his back against the shield wall as Ralph led James, Thomas and Frog out of the darkness. "I relieved your squire," said Ralph. "The boy on the wall is petrified with fear." "Geoffrey, man the wall," Richard ordered. "Send the boys to rest." "I cannot sleep," said James. "Nor I," pepped in Thomas. "Young bodies grow weary fast. I need you fresh for battle tomorrow." "Every time I close my eyes, I see the faces of dead men," Thomas whispered. "Whenever you look upon us, you see the faces of dead men," said Chaucer. "Just lay still and rest. Sleep will come or not as it will." James led the boys back to the tent and small fire. The knights gathered around a small trench carved into the hard-packed dust of the canyon floor. "I know your plan," Richard informed Ralph, "and it is good, but we face archers again tomorrow." "On whose word?" "Kit," the Troyes answered him. Kit trudged past practically sleepwalking. "Sire." "Nothing, boy. Go rest," Richard ordered. "Wait," Ralph called to him. "Do you know where the archers sleep?" "No," said Richard. "We will not risk another foray into their camp." "They would anticipate it after last night," said Connaught. "You will fight with us tomorrow," Richard said. Ralph bowed his head in acquiescence as Kit scurried back to camp. "But what of the archers?" asked Connaught. "They will pin us down to advance men over the wall," Ralph commented. "We hide behind the shields, of course," said the Troyes. "I do not wish to move the wall." Richard put a hand on the battered shield behind him. "But if we have no choice—" "I may have something," Geoffrey offered. "Chaucer, come with me." The two knights hopped the shield wall and walked through camp. They woke the resting boys and bade them follow into the woods beyond the rise. Chapter 31. The Troys helped Ralph strip robes off the Saracens in the dead wall. It was a physically intensive process as they tugged parts in and out of the mass of flesh and tore at the fabric. "I would have gone with you into their camp," said the Troys. "I may still go," Ralph grunted. "You would disobey Richard." "What does it matter where I fall?" He shrugged. "Here, there. I will take a man as I can with me to meet their Allah." "We may do more together than apart," said the Troys. "Here or there." "You will not go with me." "Now who gives commands?" joked the giant. "Then we fall together, here," Ralph said. "I would rather have no one else by my side." The giant held out a hand. After a moment, Ralph gripped his forearm and they shook tightly. "Are you going to compose a ballad for me?" Ralph grunted. "Chaucer had the right of it," the Troys laughed softly. "You are funny." Chapter 32. Chaucer and Geoffrey led the boys to the dead wall. Each of them carried a small canvas sack. They painted the bodies with cloth brushes, rubbed pitch across the corpses. Richard stood on the edge of the trench as Connaught emptied a bag of pitch across the bottom. "Will they fall for it again?" "The smoke will add to the confusion," he said. "Theirs or ours." "It is a good plan, Connaught." "It is a madman's plan, Richard, but we are all mad to be here." He dumped a second bag of pitch across the floor, then followed Richard back to their small camp to await the dawn. Chapter 33. Dawn broke the darkness at the edge of the eastern sky with a gradual light that bled the night from black to purple to pink, then blue. The light in morning is different from the day before. Micro-movement in the arc of the sun, combined with adjustments in the earth, cast a little difference in the hue of each day. Richard stood with Ralph at the dead wall and peered through the head-hole. "They line the archers," he informed Ralph. Ralph turned and waved to the others. 200 yards behind the shield wall, Geoffrey and Chaucer adjusted their white-stained tunics and double-checked their sword belts. "Will this work?" Chaucer asked. "It is sacrilege to them. Our God, their Allah. I wonder what they would think of all this." "We will soon find out," Geoffrey answered, as they stared at the dead wall below. Ralph stood next to Richard and waited. "How long since you prayed?" Richard's voice broke his reverie. "Too long," Ralph answered. "Do you need some time?" "I need a lifetime." He gazed through the hole in the wall, but his mind drifted. Chapter 34. A small wooden church nestled off a forest path in an Eden-like setting. Giant trees provided ample shade from the warm sunlight that drifted through the leaves and painted the meadow with shafts of brilliant light. A cloud drifted across the face of the sun as a bearded man astride a giant warhorse rode into the meadow. Ralph dropped the reins and slid off the side of his horse. He clumped up the stairs and booted the door open. Inside, it was simple. Wooden benches lined up in front of a pulpit, with an altar set up for communion under a gorgeous stained glass relief. It depicted the crucifixion in crude rendition. Ralph ignored it and instead focused on the altar. He drew his sword and smashed in the top. A small jewel-encrusted chalice gleamed on a silver serving platter next to a chest of reliquaries and a bread box. He opened the bread box and grabbed a loaf with his grubby hands. He held it up to the cross in the window. "Take, eat." He ripped out a chunk with his teeth and chewed loudly. With his other hand, he reached for the silver decanter. "Stop!" screamed the priest. Ralph dropped the bread and spun around to spy a portly priest in a simple brown robe standing in the doorway. "This is a holy place you are violating," the priest said in a high-pitched voice. "I need sanctuary, priest," said Ralph. "From the sun." The priest moved into the church, but kept his distance from Ralph. "You are about to drink the blood of Christ." Ralph lifted the decanter and drank deeply. He filled his mouth and let red wine run down the sides to spill on the floor. He speared the fallen bread and held it out to the priest. "Sir!" The priest shrieked and rushed him. Ralph stepped aside and swatted him on the ass with the flat of his blade as he passed. "What you are doing is wrong." "The church is here to help the poor. I am poor. Do I not deserve the church's help?" He picked up the dropped chalice, double-checked to make sure it was empty, and dropped into a leather pouch at his side. "The church helps those who help themselves. I will help myself," said Ralph. "To all you have." The priest rushed him again. Ralph knocked him against the wall. It cracked under his body weight and spilled 2 lit candles onto the floor that rolled under a bench. "You want to fight me?" Ralph taunted. The priest clambered up, sucked wind to catch his breath. He furrowed his brow in determination. The tinder dry wood of the bench caught fire, which spread across the wood floor like kindling. "I do not want to fight. I wish only to stop you." "I will stop, if you will fight," Ralph glared at him with a feral grin. "And will you leave the instruments of Christ after you've killed me?" "What will you care?" Ralph shot back. He stepped toward the priest, sword held high. The flames raced across the floor between them. "At least you will have a pyre," laughed Ralph. He stepped through the fire. With a giant crack, the floor split open and collapsed. Ralph fell, off balance, and crashed into the ground and knocked his head on the wooden edge of the floor. His sword skittered away as he faded in and out. The portly priest kneeled over him. "You fight for the wrong reasons." The priest struggled to lift Ralph over his shoulder. He limped out of the flaming church. "The silver," Ralph gasped. "You are more important than silver." Ralph collapsed against the edge of a stream as the priest dropped him. He faded in and out of darkness. "Your leg is broken," the priest explained during a lucid moment. "I will try to set it. This is going to hurt." He grabbed Ralph by the ankle and jerked. Ralph screamed in pain and lunged forward. He passed out. Ralph opened his eyes. The afternoon sun sent shafts of light in a different direction, bathed the meadow in a soft golden glow. He glanced over at the priest. Dead eyes stared at him, mouth open, a knife in his chest. Ralph glanced down at his blood-covered hands, the straightened leg, and back into the priest's open, staring eyes. Chapter 35. Ralph stared into the filmy eyes of a Saracen in the dead wall. "They come," he said. He turned and motioned to the others. Archers below lined up in a checkerboard pattern. In a synchronized movement, they drew their bows and filled the air with arrows. Richard and Ralph raised their shields over their heads and ducked behind them as arrows rained down on them and clattered off. Further back, a few arrows made it past the shield wall and were easily battered down by the knights. A second wave followed, and then a third. Sword-bearers moved between the archers and the timing of their draws. They charged up the pass. Richard set a torch to the pitch-covered bodies. He and Ralph backed slowly away, shields held steady to keep them covered. They stepped over the pit and reached the shield wall. The dead wall erupted in flames. The silent swordsmen screamed in outrage. The advance guard behind them surged forward. The first 10 hit a small trench and stepped on hidden branches. The wood bounced up like a fulcrum and impaled them on swords lashed to the branches. Men screamed in agonized wails. They fell as the guard behind them pushed forward, knocked aside the impaled men. They ploughed across a second trench and set off a second sword trap. The line disintegrated as they reached the flaming wall of dead. 4 Saracens tried to put out the flames, but their robes caught fire. They screamed and fell as men around them tried to beat out the flames. The dead wall teetered and crumpled forward. Flaming bodies crashed down on top of the advance. It trapped men underneath the flames, and parts rolled further down the pass, scattered the guard. Ralph stood in front of them, brandishing a lance he had used to shove the wall down. "Come on, you bastards!" he roared. The Saracens bellowed. 20 swordsmen pushed past the flames and rushed him. Ralph skittered back toward the shield wall. The archers aimed at his retreating form and let fly. Arrows scattered around him. 2 bounced off the shield he wore across his back. Ralph leapt from the pit from memory, and hoped he gauged correctly. The smoke and noise and chaos were confusing. The first 10 swordsmen that chased him hit the pit and fell through dust-covered robes that camouflaged a hole in the ground. They landed on swords buried in the ground, point up. The second 10 swordsmen pulled up short and fought for balance on the edge of the shallow pit. They lost as momentum for the third and fourth wave smashed into them. They fell into the pit, dragged others with them. Some tripped over fallen bodies. Men shouted and yelled. Chaucer and Geoffrey, Thomas, Frog and Julius drew flaming arrows from the fire and shot them in the air. 3 hit the pit. Fire swished across the pit and engulfed the men inside. Flames licked on trails of pitch back to where the dead wall had been. The narrow rock walls channeled the heat up and down. Men wheeled as they cooked. Soldiers on fire stumbled down the pass and into the milling guard. Ralph and Richard turned their shields toward the shield wall and ducked behind them. The knight bowman drew again. "Into the smoke, boys!" screamed Geoffrey. "You will not hit one of ours!" They released their arrows, drew and released again and again. Ralph and Richard exchanged glances onto the relative safety of their shields as an arrow bounced off the campside. "Frog," Ralph joked. "Chaucer," Richard answered, "angry that you stole the slave girl from him." The men grinned at each other. James counted out the remaining arrows into small piles in front of the archers, trying to keep them replenished. 100, he screamed. Chaucer drew and released. "What remains?" 17. "Save them," he ordered. He finished the pile in front of him, dropped the bow, and drew his sword. "Thomas, Frog, stay here. Pick off who you can." He bounced toward the shield wall. "Aim true," screamed Geoffrey. "Aim well." He drew his sword and followed Chaucer. They joined Connaught, de Troyes, James, Kit and Julius, who waited beside the shield wall. "Ready!" Connaught shouted. They all drew swords and vaulted the wall. Chapter 36. A wave of swordsmen bore down on them. Richard and Ralph sprung up and fought. They held the onslaught back for a moment, long enough for the others to smash into the Saracens, slash and hack. The knights shoved them down the pass, but there are too many of them. Slowly the press of bodies forced them back. Scimitars clang against broadsword and shield. Robed limbs dropped to the ground. Men wheeled as blood spurted. The Saracens forced the knights behind the wall. It brought little relief, except they could only approach one through each hole. The knights hacked each soldier that fought forward. Their bodies piled between the holes, filled them. An injured Saracen lashed out with his scimitar, sliced Chaucer across his hamstring. He fell as a second soldier smashed into him. An arrow slammed into Julius's chest. He spun around, spit blood, and fell against the Troyes. The dead boy got tangled up in the giant's legs, tripped him. Another wave of swordsmen washed up the pass and over the fire. They fell upon the wall in an explosion of steel and shouts. Thomas and Frog stood over the last pile of arrows and took deliberate aim at the Saracens. Where they shot, soldiers pitched over and fell. Ralph fought alone in the corner. His rear was protected by a stack of dead bodies. He slashed even more as blood trickled down the pass. Richard and Connaught fought their way to the Troyes and lifted the giant up. A Saracen leapt past Connaught's guard, hacked down with his blade, and cleaved the knight. The remaining 5 knights and boys fell back to the campfires. Thomas and Frog dropped their bows and drew swords to join them. 3 waves of 10 Saracens knocked down the shield wall and pushed toward the knights. Ralph ripped off his shredded jerkin to reveal a Saracen robe. He donned the hood and blended in with the enemy as they ran. He slashed left and right with the tip of his sword, plunged it into the back of men in front of him. The rush faltered as the swordsmen reacted to the man with 2 blades in their midst. They turned to fight him, but the crush and forward momentum of so many bodies in the canyon crashed over them. Ralph took advantage of the chaos and wreaked havoc. Richard rallied the others. They turned to face the wave. It smashed over them and around them. Kit fell with a slash from a scimitar. Geoffrey killed 3 men with 1 swipe and was struck from behind as he drew his blade back. Richard fought a quartet of jabbering Saracens who poked and prodded at him with their swords. James bashed into them, used his shoulder to knock them aside. He sliced a man's throat, reached down to help Richard up. A sword plunged out of his stomach. The boy looked at Richard and grinned. Blood dripped from his mouth. He fell. Richard grasped the boy's sword and jerked it from his hand. There is no time to mourn. He used 2 swords, whirled and twirled among the Saracens. Their numbers also hindered them. The press of bodies too thick, too many men, too much anger, too much rage to do more than poke or prod unless they wanted to kill their own. Richard had no such hindrance. He killed 2 or 3 with each swipe of a blade. They are packed in so tight. The men in front tried to back up, gain ground, but they are unable to move. He mowed them down. The Saracens pressed back and began fighting their own in an attempt to escape. Richard chased them down, hacked from behind. He lopped off heads and arms and legs. The noise was deafening. The screams and wails bounced off the rock walls. Ralph joined Richard in a pincer movement. He fought in from an angle. The Saracens struggled harder to run. Thomas fell to a sword-bearer. Frog hacked his killer down. The dead Saracen collapsed on top of him and dragged the boy into the muck. Detroit picked up a man and tossed him into a row of Saracens. He screamed in rage and swung his sword across the row. Heads plopped off and bounced away. He joined Richard and Ralph in beating back the rush. The Saracens pushed past the pit and fumbled down the pass beyond the oily and still smoking stain where the dead wall had been. The knights let them run. They paused to catch their breath. Chests heaved. Muscles trembled. The dead carpeted the canyon pass before them. Bare ground was hard to discern. "Damn good show," gasped Detroit. He collapsed forward. 2 swords jutted from his massive back. Richard and Ralph moved to the collapsed shield wall. "Many ideas?" Richard asked. "Fight. Die." 2 days, he grinned at Ralph. "We bought the army. 2 days." A breeze shifted overhead and blew the smoke back on the advance guard. The sun beamed. Ralph let the golden rays wash over his face. "It is a good day," he breathed. Richard picked up a shield and passed it to him. He selected one of his own. "We should have all worn robes," he said. "We might have killed each other," Ralph answered. "Perhaps in the next battle." Horns trilled down in the canyon. Richard hitched up the shield and readied his sword. "Shall we take it to them?" Ralph laughed. "At last you speak some sense." Chapter 37. 2 shields bobbed down the pass toward the advance guard. The soldiers grew quiet as they watched the brazen approach. Silence from greater than 1,000 men held the valley still. A white flag bobbed up from the edge of the advance guard. It bounced across the lines as a sedan surrounded by 20 men swept past the soldiers. Richard and Ralph planted their shields and waited. "Do not trust them," Ralph said. "They will remember what happened to the last one." "That is what I'm talking about." The sedan stopped 10 yards from the 2 knights. 2 bearers rushed forward and set up the rug and stool. Saeed stepped from the sedan. He marched to the stool and sat. A boy bearing a flag rushed to stand beside him. Saeed beckoned the knights closer. They moved to the edge of the carpet and held their swords point down. "You are mighty warriors," Saeed started. "You speak our tongue." Saeed glanced at a guard who nodded towards Ralph. "We did not want the risk of a mistranslation like the one that occurred the last time we met under a flag of truce." "My terms still stand," said Richard. "Withdraw and survive." Saeed nodded gravely. "Before 2 days ago I would have laughed at your bravado and your demands," he said. "I would have thought as my predecessor. Now, however, I will agree to your terms." Richard stared at him, shocked. He remembered to keep his mouth from hanging open. "You will?" "You have killed almost 800 of the Sultan's soldiers. Despite the generous geographic advantage you have held, that is still an impressive number. We do not want to waste any more resources to discover how many more you may add to that number." "You were just going to leave?" asked Ralph. "Yes, we are," said the diplomat. "We have met with your general again at his encampment and negotiated a successful agreement with him." "Louis," Richard muttered. "Yes, that is your general, is he not?" "When?" "We met before this battle began, and have bartered every day since. You have put him in a very powerful position." Ralph growled. It started low in his throat, but grumbled louder. Richard reached out and put a steadying hand on his forearm. The guards around the sedan still shifted back a step. "You agreed to meet him at a second camp and parley there?" "That is what we decided in our last meeting at this place," said Said. "And my men," Richard rumbled. "Glorious warriors. Who fought for nothing." "Who fought for nothing." No, not nothing." The diplomat bobbed his head in wonder. "Your general achieved quite a bit for their fighting, lands, titles. He is going to be a very rich man." The tip of Richard's sword wavered up. He pointed it at Said, muscles trembling as rage coursed through his veins. Ralph reached out and laid a hand on his arm this time. "Withdraw your army," he ordered Said. "It is begun." The diplomat gestured. Behind him, horns sounded as the advance guard slowly retreated like a receding tide across the canyon floor. "We will leave our regiment to retrieve our dead," Said said. His breath came fast and loud. "Tomorrow," said Ralph. Said glanced back at his swordsman. "Please, do not desecrate our dead again." Ralph nodded. "We won't one night, to care for our own. We will not touch your men." "Agree," said the diplomat, his head bobbing again. "We will meet again. I go to your general's camp as an honoured guest tomorrow." Ralph backed away. He kept a hand on Richard's arm and led him back to where the shield wall had kept them safe. They watched the sedan move through the advance guard and across the canyon. "Honour," he spat. "Glory." He grabbed Troy's under the arms and dragged the body back towards the camp. Richard stood at the shield wall site and stared down at the carnage in mute horror. Chapter 38. Ralph bent over and groaned. He grabbed a dead man by the robe and lifted. With his other hand he grabbed a second and prepared to drag Frog off for proper burial. The boy jumped and stirred. "One more." Ralph lifted him up and placed him on his feet. He held the boy steady for a moment. "Good. Are you injured?" He checked Frog over. The boy was covered with blood that was not his own, and just seemed dazed. "Help me gather our dead," Ralph instructed. He left the boy and grabbed Geoffrey. He dragged the dead weight of a knight in armour and mail up to the tent. Frog stared around at the carnage and shuddered. He hurried after Ralph. Ralph dropped Geoffrey's corpse in a line with the others. The knights and boys were lined up in a row. Ralph ripped down the tent and used his sword to shred it into cowls that he draped over them. Frog kneeled at their feet and wept. Richard walked up behind him and looked at his brothers and their charges. So much lost for land and title. He sat on the ground beside Frog and cradled him as they wept together. Ralph dragged up Chaucer. He folded the poet's arms across his narrow chest and brushed his hair back from his blood-crusted face as he listened to Richard and Frog. Chapter 39. Later that night, Richard and Frog and Ralph stood over 13 shallow graves at the edge of the pass. 13 will always be an unlucky number, said Richard. Another legend for Chaucer to tell, Ralph answered. Chapter 40. The next morning, they marched down the far side of the rise on the trail left by the retreating army. They reached the edge of the camp just after sunset. Sentries challenged their passage. The knights and Frog were unrecognizable, blood and gore-covered ghosts that shuffled up the dust-covered road. Sir Richard! Get my horses and kit, Richard commanded a passing soldier. The soldier nodded and started to run. Richard grabbed his arm. Bring it to the general's tent. As the man rushed off into the darkness of the camp, Richard and Ralph marched towards a large tent at the centre of camp to report in. Chapter 41. The general's tent was larger and a little more opulent, but still had 2 guards posted on either side of the entrance. They blocked the passage as Richard tried to enter. Ralph jerked out his sword and shoved the sharp tip against the throat of one of the men. "Study closely," he growled. "Stand aside, or his will be the last face you see." The second guard swiped at his sword. Ralph punched him in the throat and knocked him down. The first guard exercised wisdom and stood aside. "Frog, guard them," Richard commanded. Frog drew his sword and stood in front of the tent. He faced off against the 2 men, and they backed a short distance away at the sight of this battle-tested boy with the nicked sword that glared at them. Chapter 42. If the outside was large, the inside was set up in a crozier manner that bordered on luxurious. 3 large throne-like chairs were gathered around a smoky brazier at one end. Pillows and tapestries adorned the walls and floor. The 2 tables were set up, but the feast on one was lavish. Voluminous sheer veils draped the walls, hiding shadows and entrances to further back in the tent. Saeed sat in one of the chairs beside Louis, his 4 Saracen bodyguards arrayed against one of the walls. Louis had 2 bodyguards against the other wall. They looked up as Richard marched in. Louis swallowed and shifted the look on his face to a smile. Come in, he bellowed. "The heroes welcome home." "I have enjoyed telling your lord of your magnificent victory," Saeed called from the chairs. "Where are the others?" Louis smirked. "There are no others." He nodded and put on a grave face. "That is unfortunate. Really too bad," said the general. "Still, I can now grant to you both estates, a little larger than I had planned since you are the only survivors." Saeed stood from the back of the tent. "I must leave, General, so you may discuss matters that are private." He motioned to his bodyguards. Louis turned to his men and snapped his fingers. They slipped into one of the shadows behind a veil that hid an entrance to a smaller alcove and pulled out Jasmine. Her face was bruised, her clothes ripped, and her hands bound in front of her. "You," she croaked as she spied Ralph. "Do not forget your bounty," Louis smiled to Saeed. "He paid a handsome ransom for this one." Jasmine yanked against her captors in an attempt to reach Ralph. The diplomat's bodyguards moved in front of her and jerked her into the entourage. Ralph surged forward. Richard grabbed his arm and held him stay. "A moment, General. Where is Sir de Troyes?" Louis squinted at him and raised an eyebrow. "Dead," he smirked. "On the field of battle with you. His squire arrived with a preposterous story about inheriting the title. A commoner. That seemed hardly likely. I confiscated the lands for safekeeping, and the boy is being punished for desertion." There were 7 seals on the table, the knight's identification to what remained of their holdings and titles. The general picked through them and showed one to Richard. It was de Troyes. The general put it back in the pile and scooted them all together, closer to him. "And my lands?" Richard asked. "Safe, here with me." "What of the boy?" Louis shifted away from Richard and glanced at the far end of the tent. He looked back at Richard and said grimly, "No boy came with the squire." "He lies," Jasmine cried. "The boy is in his chamber." Saeed lashed out and slapped her with the back of his hand. She crashed against the table and fell. Ralph jerked his arm free from Richard and leapt into the bodyguards. He lashed out with his sword and they fell in 4 quick swings. The general's guard surged forward and whipped out their swords. Ralph ducked under their blades, weaved and relieved their bodies of heads. Ralph turned to Saeed, who backed against the chair. Please, said the diplomat. Ralph skewered him and ripped up. He wiped his sword on a clean part of the man's robes and sawed through the bonds holding Jasmine. Louis stood gaping at the speed and viciousness of the attack. It had taken seconds, mere seconds, for one man to destroy 7. Blood spray-stained his face as he turned to Richard. "I could call this whole camp down on you," he growled. Richard stepped in close. "I have fought one army," he growled back. "I can defeat yours." "You have no idea what this will do to you." "But I know what it will do to you," answered Richard. Chapter 43. In an alcove at the back of the tent, Paul hung tied to a post. A small, thin nightshirt clings to his wispy body. He sagged against the post. Tears stained his travel-dirty face. Heavy footsteps pounded across the tent toward him, and he flinched as they grew closer. Louis's head rolled across the floor and bounced off the post. Richard stepped through the flap, a blood-drenched sword gripped tightly. "Sire!" Paul cried out. "Son," said Richard. He sliced the bonds holding the boy and pulled him into a great big hug. Chapter 44. Ralph stood in front of the tent flap with a sword in each hand. His eyes roved from standing guard to Jasmine, who stood beside him and clung to one arm. It would not be practical for battle, but he did not push her away. He did not tremble and did not flinch at her touch. She stared up at him, the broken man who saved the slave, and pressed her forehead against the ball of shoulder. "Twice," she said. "Not many get a third chance," he answered. "We still have to make it out of camp," Richard said, as he led Paul through the back of the tent. "Have any come to investigate?" he asked. "No one comes." Richard grabbed a leather satchel and swept the seals from the table. There was a small chest of jewels and gold next to them. "Will you take this?" he asked Ralph. "I do not steal any more," Ralph answered. Jasmine pulled away from Ralph and quickly loaded another pouch with treasure. "It's not stealing," she said gently. "It's paid for me." She presented the pouch to Ralph. "Twice you have saved my life. Twice you have freed me. I know you will not have me, but please have this." "I do not want gold." "Do you still want to die?" she asked. Her eyes searched his for a moment. He could not hold her stare and looked away. "I want you." She slung the pouch over her shoulder and grabbed his arm again. "I am soiled. I was a slave. I am not worthy of a noble man." "I am not noble," he said. One arm slowly snaked up and pulled her in close. "Blessed union," Richard swore. "We still have a night to save and a camp to escape." Ralph kissed the top of Jasmine's head and motioned to Richard. "I will keep you safe. Do not move from my side." "What army could force me?" she muttered into his dirty jerkin. Paul stood up in the corner with pieces of mismatched mail he had lifted from the general's dead bodyguards. He lifted a sword larger than himself and balanced it carefully. "We who are about to die, sir." Richard helped him hobble out of the tent. Chapter 45. Frog saw Paul and gave a shout. He rushed to the boy and hugged him, barely avoiding the tip of his new-found sword. The scared soldier jogged up with Richard's horse and kit. Richard mounted his stallion and glared down at the general's guards. "No one disturbs the general," he commanded. "Yes, sir," they announced. Richard reined his horse around. He held a hand down to Paul. The boy struggled to put a foot in the stirrup so he could hop up behind, but the pieces of chainmail were too heavy for his small body. He almost fell. Ralph caught him and lifted him up to the back of the horse. He made sure the boy had his sword secure. "I know where they keep Leon," Paul said. "Meet me at the corral," Richard ordered. "Get their horses and kits." Ralph nodded. He waited for Richard and Paul to trot through the camp, then, with one last withering glance at the guards, led Jasmine to the corral. Chapter 46. A flogging post stood in the middle of a clearing. Leon dangled from the simple wooden structure, arms arched over his head. His back was a ribbon of stripes. Blood dripped across his breeches and turned the dirt to mud. Soldiers gathered around and jeered. A master-at-arms pulled back a cat-o'-nine-tails and lashed it across Leon's back. He was so far gone in pain, he didn't even cry out. Richard shoved his mount between the soldiers on the edge of the clearing. His entrance drew silence. "Stay," he commanded Paul as he slid off the side of his horse. He marched up towards the post. "You have no right," the master-at-arms began. Richard whipped out his sword, sliced off the soldier's head, and continued to the post. He slashed the bindings that held Leon and scooped up the boy. He turned and walked for his horse, mounted, and held the boy across his lap with one hand, sword ready to answer any questions in the other. Chapter 47. Frog readied a string of the knight's horses at the corral. He hopped on one as Richard rode up with Paul and Leon. "Will he live?" Ralph asked. Leon muttered intelligibly and struggled to stand as he slipped from Richard's mount. He held himself against the horse for a moment, then lurched to a second horse, and very carefully dragged himself up. "He has spirit," said Richard, as the boy settled onto the horse. "Will you?" the knight asked Ralph. Ralph glanced over his shoulder to Jasmine, who sat clumsy astride her mount. "I will try." Richard nodded and led them out of the camp at the head of 18 horses. "That is all any can ask of us." Thus ends the first adventures of the Knights of the Temple. This has been Holy War, Bloodbound, an action fantasy. Holy War Series Book 1. Written by Chris Lowry. Narrated by Andrew McDermott. Copyright 2016 by Christopher D. Lowry. Production copyright by Christopher D. Lowry.